My name is Kevin Martinez, and I've been a backcountry ranger at Yellowstone for 7 years. I know every trail, every hot spring, every hidden valley in the park's 2.2 million acres. I've seen wolves reintroduced to their ancient hunting grounds, watched grizzly bears fish for salmon in pristine streams, and witnessed the raw power of geothermal forces that could reshape the landscape overnight. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what emerged from the ashes of the Grizzly Creek burn zone. The fire had been particularly devastating, burning hot and fast through a section of old-growth forest that hadn't seen flames in over a century. When it was finally contained, it left behind a moonscape of charred stumps and ash-covered ground that stretched for miles in every direction. Firefighters and cleanup crews worked the area for weeks, but they kept reporting unusual findings. Tools would go missing overnight. Equipment would be found moved or rearranged in ways that suggested intelligence rather than random animal activity. And there were the sounds, childlike laughter echoing through the burned forest at night, always just out of sight. The first official incident occurred in late August. A wildlife biologist named Dr. Sarah Winters was conducting a post-fire ecological assessment when she reported seeing children playing in the burn zone. When she approached to warn them about the dangers of the unstable terrain, they vanished into the forest. Dr. Winters described them as appearing to be between 8 and 12 years old, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, long dresses for the girls, knickers and suspenders for the boys. But what disturbed her most was their behavior. They moved through the burned landscape with perfect familiarity, leaping over fallen logs and navigating treacherous terrain as if they could see perfectly despite the thick smoke that still lingered in the area. Park officials assumed they were dealing with trespassing families, perhaps campers who'd ignored the closure orders. Additional patrols were scheduled, but no unauthorized visitors were found. The reports continued, though maintenance workers, researchers, even other rangers reported glimpses of children in the burn zone. That's when I was assigned to investigate. I entered the burn zone on September 15th, carrying full camping gear for a 3-day solo survey. My mission was simple: determine if there were any safety hazards preventing the reopening of the area to researchers, and investigate the reports of unauthorized persons in the closure zone. The burned forest was a surreal landscape. 47,000 acres of what had been pristine wilderness now looked like an alien planet. Blackened tree trunks stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of ash that muffled every footstep. The air still carried the acrid smell of smoke, and visibility was limited by a perpetual haze. I set up my first camp near what had been Grizzly Creek, though the stream was now just a muddy trickle flowing between charred banks. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and I found myself grateful for the warmth of my campfire. That's when I heard the first laugh. It came from somewhere in the burned forest around my camp, a child's giggle, bright and innocent, completely out of place in the desolate landscape. I called out, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking if anyone needed help. The only response was another laugh, this one from a different direction. I grabbed my flashlight and searched the area around my camp, but found no sign of anyone. The ash was perfect for showing footprints, but aside from my own tracks, the ground was unmarked. The laughter continued throughout the night, sometimes seeming to come from multiple children at once. They never answered my calls, never came close enough to be seen clearly, but they were definitely there, watching, playing some kind of game I didn't understand. The next morning, I found evidence of their presence. My equipment had been moved during the night. Not stolen or damaged, just rearranged. My water bottles had been lined up in a perfect row. My maps had been folded into paper airplanes. Small wildflowers, the only living plants I'd seen in the burn zone, had been arranged in a circle around my tent. It was the kind of mischief you'd expect from curious children, but there was something unsettling about the precision of it. The flower circle was mathematically perfect, and the paper airplanes were folded with a skill that suggested adult hands despite the childish nature of the prank. I spent the day exploring deeper into the burn zone, following what had been the main trail before the fire. The destruction was total. Not a single tree had survived the blaze, and the ground was bare of any vegetation. But as I hiked, I began to notice something strange. The fire hadn't burned evenly. There were patches where the destruction was absolute, where even the roots of plants had been incinerated. but scattered throughout the burn zone were small areas, perfect circles maybe 20 feet in diameter, where the fire had barely touched the ground. In these circles, I found the remains of old structures. Stone foundations, mostly, but also metal objects that had somehow survived the intense heat. Looking closer, I realized these were the remains of homesteads, buildings that had been abandoned long before the area became part of Yellowstone National Park. According to park records, this area had been settled briefly in the 1880s by families seeking to homestead in the remote valleys. But the settlements had been abandoned within a few years, the residents driven out by harsh winters and isolation. The forest had reclaimed the area so completely that no trace of human habitation had been visible for over a century, until the fire stripped away the concealing vegetation. That night, I camped near one of these foundation circles. As darkness fell, the children returned. This time, they were bolder. I could hear them moving through the ash around my camp, their footsteps light but clearly audible. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, small figures darting between the burned tree trunks, always just out of reach of my flashlight beam. They were playing again, but their games were more elaborate now. I would hear one child call to another in a language I didn't recognize, followed by running footsteps and delighted laughter. Sometimes they seemed to be playing tag, chasing each other in complex patterns through the burned forest. But when I tried to join in, tried to call out to them or follow their movements, they would fall silent and still. It was as if they existed in a space parallel to mine, able to observe me, but not quite able to interact directly. Around midnight, one of them spoke to me. The voice came from directly behind my tent, so close I could have reached out and touched the speaker. It was a young girl's voice, maybe 9 or 10 years old, speaking in accented English that sounded like it came from another century. "Are you here to take us away again?" she asked. I turned slowly, not wanting to startle her, but saw nothing. The voice had been clear and close, but there was no one there. "I'm a park ranger," I said to the empty darkness. "I'm just here to make sure the area is safe. Are you lost? Do you need help?" Silence for a long moment, then, "We've been waiting such a long time. Are our families coming back for us?" My blood ran cold. Families. Coming back. The implications were horrifying. "What's your name?" I asked gently. Mary came to reply. "Mary Hutchinson. My papa said he'd come back for us when he found work in the city." That was how long has it been? I did quick mental math. The homesteads had been abandoned in the 1880s. If this was somehow a survivor of that era, she'd been waiting for over 130 years. But that was impossible. No one could survive that long, especially not a child. "Mary," I said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, sadder. "I don't know anymore. The seasons stopped changing after the big sleep. We wake up sometimes, but everything's different. The forest grew over our houses, and Mama's garden is all gone. The big sleep." I had a sudden, terrible understanding of what she meant. "Mary, how many of you are there?" "All of us. Tommy and Sarah and little Beth. The Morrison children from down the valley. The Hendersons' twin boys. We're all here, waiting for our families to come back." I counted quickly. The historical records mentioned at least 6 families who had attempted to settle in this area. If they had left their children behind. "Mary, where are your parents now?" "They went to the city for work. Said they'd send for us when they got settled. But they never came back. We waited and waited, and then it got so cold, and we were so hungry." The picture was becoming clear, and it was heartbreaking. These families had abandoned their homesteads, probably planning to return for their children once they'd established themselves elsewhere. But something had gone wrong. The parents had never returned, and the children had been left to face the brutal wilderness winter alone. They had died here. All of them. Frozen, starved, abandoned by the adults who were supposed to protect them. But somehow they had never left. "Mary," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think your parents. I think they couldn't come back. They wanted to, but they couldn't." "I know," she said simply. "We figured that out after the big sleep. But we're still here. We're still waiting." Other voices joined hers now, children's voices speaking from different directions around my camp. They introduced themselves with names from another century: Ezra, Constance, Jeremiah, little Susanna, who couldn't have been more than 6 when she died. They told me their stories in fragments, memories that had been preserved in whatever force kept them anchored to this place. Tales of waiting for parents who never returned, of sharing dwindling food supplies, of huddling together for warmth as the first snows fell. The older children had tried to take care of the younger ones, but they were just children themselves. When the cold came, they had gathered in the largest cabin, burning furniture and anything else they could find for fuel. They had held each other as the temperature dropped, singing songs their mothers had taught them, telling stories to keep the little ones from being afraid. And when the end came, they had simply not left. "We thought it was a dream at first," said a boy's voice that identified itself as Tommy Morrison. "We woke up and everything was warm again, and we could play in the forest without getting cold or hungry. But our houses were all grown over, and new people came sometimes, but they couldn't see us very well. We learned to stay hidden," added another voice. "The new people got scared when they saw us. They ran away, or they brought others who tried to take us away from home. But we can't leave," Mary said. "This is where Mama and Papa said to wait. This is where they'll look for us when they come back." I sat in the darkness, surrounded by the voices of children who had been dead for over a century, trying to process what I was experiencing. Ghosts were one thing, residual hauntings, echoes of traumatic events that replayed themselves in certain locations. But these children were interactive, aware, capable of learning and adapting. They had been waiting here for 130 years, hidden by the forest that had grown over their graves, sustained by hope and the innocent belief that their parents would eventually return. "The fire brought us back," Mary explained. "We were getting so faint, so hard to see. The forest was making us sleepy again. But when everything burned, we could wake up properly. We could play in the open again, without all the trees hiding us." That explained the reports. The fire had stripped away the forest that had concealed the old homesteads, and somehow it had also strengthened the children's ability to manifest in the physical world. "Are you going to stay with us?" asked a tiny voice that must have been little Susanna. "It gets lonely with just us, and the rangers usually run away." Rangers, plural. I wasn't the first to encounter them. "How many rangers have you met?" I asked. "3, said Tommy. "But they all got scared and left. You're the first one who's really talked to us." I thought about Dr. Winters and the other witnesses who had reported seeing children in the burn zone. They had probably encountered exactly what I was experiencing now, but had dismissed it as impossible or tried to rationalize it away. "We miss having grown-ups around," Mary said wistfully. "We've been taking care of ourselves for so long, but sometimes we forget things, like how to be proper, or what games are appropriate for Sunday." The tragedy of their situation hit me like a physical blow. These children had been maintaining their existence for over a century, but they were still just children. They still needed guidance, structure, the safety that adults were supposed to provide. "I'll stay," I heard myself saying. "For tonight, at least. We can talk more in the morning." The relief in their voices was palpable. For the first time in over a century, an adult had acknowledged their existence and chosen to stay rather than flee. They settled around my camp like any group of children would, finding comfortable spots on the ash-covered ground. I couldn't see them clearly. They appeared as vague shapes at the edges of my vision, more suggestion than solid form, but their presence was undeniable. "Will you tell us about the outside world?" asked Ezra. "What's it like now? Are there still horses and wagons?" I spent the night sharing stories of the modern world, trying to explain automobiles and airplanes and computers to children whose reference points were oil lamps and wood stoves. They listened with fascination, asking questions that revealed both their intelligence and their isolation. But as dawn approached, they began to fade. "We're strongest at night," Mary explained as her voice grew fainter. "The daylight makes us sleepy, but we'll be back when the sun goes down." By sunrise, I was alone in the burned forest again, but the evidence of their presence remained. New arrangements of stones and flowers, messages spelled out in the ash, small gifts left beside my tent, a perfectly preserved bird's nest, a piece of quartz crystal, a child's hair ribbon that should have disintegrated decades ago. I spent the day exploring more of the foundation sites, trying to piece together the history of the failed settlements. What I found was a story of multiple tragedies, families that had come west seeking a better life, only to discover that the harsh wilderness was unforgiving to those unprepared for its challenges. The children's stories had been essentially accurate. Their parents had indeed left them behind, intending to return once they had established themselves in more civilized areas. But the parents had faced their own struggles, economic hardship, illness, the countless difficulties of 19th century frontier life. Some had died in the cities they traveled to. Others had been unable to earn enough money to return for their children. A few had tried to come back but had been prevented by early snows or impassable terrain. The children had been abandoned not out of cruelty, but out of circumstances beyond anyone's control. That made their century-long vigil even more heartbreaking. That evening, they returned as promised. "Did you learn about our families?" Mary asked hopefully. I told them what I had discovered, as gently as I could. Some of the children took the news better than others. The older ones seemed to have suspected the truth, while the younger ones struggled to understand why their parents had broken their promises. "So they're not coming back?" Little Susanna asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "No, sweetheart," I said. "They're not coming back. They wanted to, but they couldn't." The silence that followed was heartbreaking. Then Tommy spoke up, his voice trying to be brave. "Well, we gotten pretty good at taking care of ourselves. We can keep waiting if we need to." "You don't have to wait anymore," I said. "You can rest now. You can go find your families wherever they are." "But this is our home," protested Ezra. "We belong here." "You belong with your families," I replied. "And they're not here anymore. They haven't been here for a very long time." The debate continued through the night. Some of the children were ready to accept that their vigil was over, that they could finally lay down the burden of waiting. Others were afraid to leave the only home they remembered, terrified of venturing into the unknown. As dawn approached, Mary spoke for the group. "We need to think about it," she said. "We've been here so long, it's hard to imagine being anywhere else. Can you come back tomorrow night? We'll have an answer then." I agreed, but I knew what I had to do. These children had been trapped by their own innocence and loyalty, unable to move on because they had been taught to wait for their parents' return. They needed an adult's permission to stop waiting, to finally rest. The next evening, I returned to the camp with a decision. I spoke to the park authorities. I told them, stretching the truth only slightly. "They've been looking for you for a long time. Your family sent messages asking the rangers to find you and tell you that it's okay to stop waiting. They want you to come home to them." It was a lie, but a necessary one. These children needed to believe that they had permission to leave, that their parents approved of their decision to end their vigil. One by one, they began to agree. "If Mama says it's okay," whispered Susanna. "If Papa really sent word," added Tommy. Mary was the last to consent. As the oldest, she had carried the responsibility for the others for over a century. Letting go of that burden was the hardest thing she had ever done. "You promise they won't be angry with us for leaving?" she asked. "They won't be angry," I assured her. "They'll be proud of how well you took care of each other. They'll be happy to see you again." As the night wore on, the children began to change. Their voices grew lighter, more at peace. The constant undercurrent of anxiety that had marked their existence began to fade. "I can see them," Mary said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder. "I can see Mama and Papa. They're waiting for us." "Where?" I asked. "In the light," she said. "There's a light, and they're all there. All our families. They look just like they did when they left, but happier. They're not worried anymore." One by one, the children said goodbye. They thanked me for listening to their stories, for giving them permission to stop waiting, for treating them like the real children they had always been. "Will you remember us?" asked little Susanna. "Always," I promised. "Will you tell people we were here? That we were good children, who did what we were told?" "I'll tell them," I said. "I'll make sure people know." As dawn broke over the burned forest, they faded for the last time. But this fading was different from the others. It was peaceful, final, complete. The children of the burned forest had finally gone home. I spent one more day in the burn zone, but the quality of silence had changed. The oppressive weight of tragedy had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace that seemed to permeate the damaged landscape. When I filed my report, I wrote that the area was safe for researchers and that the reports of children in the burn zone had been explained by equipment malfunction and psychological stress among the investigation teams. The area was reopened to scientific study within the week. But I also did something else. I researched the historical records more thoroughly, tracking down every detail I could find about the failed homesteads and the families who had attempted to settle there. I compiled a comprehensive report, not for the Park Service, but for the local historical society. The story of the abandoned children became part of the official history of the region. A small memorial was erected at one of the foundation sites, acknowledging the tragedy and honoring the children who had waited so long for their families to return. Sometimes, when I patrol the backcountry areas of Yellowstone, I think about those children. How they had maintained their vigil for over a century, clinging to hope and innocence in a world that had forgotten them. How they had finally found peace when someone simply listened to their story and gave them permission to stop waiting. The burned forest is recovering now. New growth is emerging from the ash, and the scars of the fire are beginning to heal. But I'll never forget what I learned there, that love and loyalty can transcend death itself, and that sometimes the greatest kindness is simply telling someone that their wait is over. The children are at rest now. Their story has been told, their vigil has ended, and they have finally gone home to the families who never stopped loving them. But their memory lives on in the recovering forest, a reminder that some things, love, hope, the bonds between family members, are stronger than time itself. I'm Jennifer Hayes, and I've been a park ranger at Whispering Pines Resort and Recreation Area for 7 years. Our crown jewel is Pine Lake, a pristine mountain lake that draws thousands of visitors every summer for swimming, boating, and fishing. It's also the most dangerous body of water I've ever encountered, though you won't find that information in any of our tourist brochures. The lake has claimed 23 lives in the past 5 years. All drownings, all ruled accidental by the county coroner. But I've been the first responder to most of those incidents, and I know the official reports don't tell the whole story. The dead don't usually try to warn you about something waiting in the depths. It started with Maria Gonzalez, a strong swimmer from Phoenix who'd been visiting the lake with her family. She was found floating face down about 50 yards from shore, in water so clear you could see the bottom. No signs of distress, no indication of what had gone wrong. Her family insisted she was an excellent swimmer, had been on her high school swim team, never would have gotten into trouble in such calm water. When I pulled her from the lake, she wasn't breathing. No pulse, skin cold and blue, pupils fixed and dilated. By every measure I knew, Maria Gonzalez was dead. But as I started CPR, her lips moved. "Don't go in," she whispered, though no air was moving through her lungs. There, waiting. Then she was truly gone, and no amount of resuscitation could bring her back. I told myself it was just muscle reflexes, residual nerve activity, the kind of thing that happens sometimes when the brain is shutting down. The paramedics agreed. Even the coroner, when I mentioned it in my report, chalked it up to post-mortem gas exchange and suggested I might have imagined the words. But I knew what I'd heard. 3 weeks later, we found David Chin. Same story. Experienced swimmer, calm water, no apparent cause for drowning. And like Maria, he tried to speak when I pulled him from the lake. Something down there, he managed to whisper before the spark of whatever was animating him faded away. "Don't let them pull you." I should have closed the lake then. Should have demanded a full investigation, brought in dive teams, done whatever it took to figure out what was killing people in that pristine water. Instead, I let my supervisor convince me it was just coincidence, just a string of tragic accidents that would eventually run its course. We posted additional warning signs, hired extra lifeguards, implemented new safety protocols. The drownings continued. By the end of that first summer, we'd lost 8 people to Pine Lake, all strong swimmers, all found in relatively shallow water, all dead by the time we reached them. And all of them had tried to warn me about something in the depths. The warnings weren't random either. They were consistent, specific, building a picture of something that lurked beneath the surface of our beautiful lake, something that was actively hunting. Hands, gasped Robert Martinez, a Navy veteran who'd survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, only to drown in 20 feet of crystal-clear water. So many hands pulling. Eyes, whispered Sarah Kim, a college student on spring break. Watching from below, they know when you're alone. Hungry, breathed James Morrison, a local fishing guide who knew every inch of Pine Lake. Always hungry, but not for flesh. I started keeping detailed records of every drowning, every last word, every strange detail the official reports overlooked. What I found painted a picture that made me question everything I thought I knew about the lake I'd been patrolling for years. The drownings followed patterns that made no sense for random accidents. They occurred in specific areas of the lake, always during certain weather conditions, always when the victim was alone or separated from others. The water temperatures in those areas showed strange fluctuations, sudden drops of 10 or 15 degrees that lasted only minutes before returning to normal. And there were the bubbles. Every drowning site showed evidence of gas bubbles rising from the lake bottom immediately after the body was recovered. Large bubbles, too regular to be natural decomposition, too persistent to be explained by disturbed sediment. But it wasn't until the diving accident that I understood what we were really dealing with. Mark Stevens was a professional dive instructor from Colorado Springs, brought in by the county to investigate the unusual number of drownings. He was planning a systematic survey of the lake bottom, looking for hazards, unusual currents, anything that might explain why so many people were dying in apparently safe water. I was monitoring his dive from the boat, maintaining radio contact as he descended toward the deepest part of the lake. For the first 20 minutes, everything was routine. Mark reported normal visibility, no unusual features, lake bottom covered with typical sediment and debris. Then his voice changed. "Jennifer," he said through the underwater communicator, and I could hear something like awe in his voice. "You need to see this. There's something down here." "What kind of something?" I asked. "I don't know. It's big. Really big. And it's not natural." The next few minutes of radio chatter were confused, fragmentary. Mark was describing structures on the lake bottom, formations that didn't match any natural geological process. He mentioned chambers, passages, things that looked almost like buildings. Then he screamed. It came through the radio as pure terror, the kind of sound human beings make when they encounter something that breaks their understanding of reality. I grabbed the emergency ascent line and started hauling him up, but the line went slack before I'd pulled in more than a few feet. Mark's body floated to the surface 30 seconds later, but like all the others, he was already dead. Drowned, according to the autopsy, though his diving gear was intact and his oxygen supply was barely touched. And like all the others, he had something to tell me. "City," he whispered as I pulled him into the boat. "There's a city down there, and they're awake." That night, I dove the lake myself. I know it was stupid, dangerous, probably suicidal, but I'd lost too many people to whatever was living in Pine Lake, and I couldn't stand by and watch it continue to kill. I had to know what was down there. I used Mark's gear, a professional diving rig that should have kept him alive for hours underwater. I descended slowly, carefully, following the same path he'd taken to the deepest part of the lake. At 40 feet, the temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically. My wetsuit's thermal sensors registered a 20-degree plunge in less than 10 seconds. But more disturbing than the cold was the way the water itself seemed to change. It became thicker, more viscous, like swimming through syrup. At 60 feet, I saw the first structures. They weren't natural formations. They weren't human constructions either. They were something else entirely, organic curves and impossible angles that hurt to look at directly, structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. And they were occupied. The things living in those underwater structures weren't quite human, though they might have been once. They moved through the water with fluid grace, their limbs too long, too flexible, their faces distorted by whatever transformation had claimed them. But I recognized some of them. Maria Gonzalez swam past me, her dark hair flowing like seaweed, her eyes now completely black. She moved without breathing, without any of the limitations that should have applied to a human body underwater. David Chen was there too, and Sarah Kim and James Morrison. All of the drowning victims from the past 5 years changed into something that was no longer quite human but not entirely alien either. They saw me watching and began to gather around me, their movements curious rather than threatening. When Maria opened her mouth to speak, I could understand her words despite being 60 feet underwater. "You came," she said, and her voice was like the sound of waves against distant shores. "We've been calling to you, but you wouldn't listen. What happened to you?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure how I was speaking underwater either. "We were chosen," David Chin replied, his form drifting closer. "The city below needs guardians, protectors. We were selected for transformation." I looked deeper into the abyss and saw what Mark had discovered. The structures extended far below the lake's supposed bottom, forming a vast underwater city that existed in violation of every law of physics and geology I knew. And moving through its impossible architecture were things that had never been human, ancient beings that regarded the transformed drowning victims as recent additions to their eternal community. "You could join us," Sarah Kim suggested, her voice gentle and persuasive. "It's peaceful here. No more death, no more loss. Just existence in perfect harmony with the deep water." For a moment, I was tempted. The city was beautiful in its alien way, and the transformed humans seemed genuinely happy in their new existence. There was something seductive about the idea of abandoning the surface world with all its pain and responsibility. But then I thought about the families still mourning their lost loved ones, the visitors who came to Pine Lake expecting safe recreation, the future victims who would be drawn down to join this underwater community. "I can't," I said. "People need to know. They need to be warned." The gathered forms exchanged glances, and I could sense disappointment in their alien features. "You'll try to stop others from joining us," Maria said, and now there was sadness in her voice. "You'll close the lake, drive away the visitors we need." "We can't allow that," David added. "The city requires new residents. The ancient ones demand fresh perspectives, new experiences to add to their eternal collection." That's when I realized I was in serious trouble. The transformed humans began to circle me, their movements no longer casual or friendly. In the depths below, I could see larger shapes beginning to rise, the ancient inhabitants of the impossible city, coming to investigate the surface dweller who discovered their secret. I kicked hard for the surface, but the water had become even thicker, more resistant to movement. My ascent was painfully slow, and I could feel the transformed humans keeping pace with me, not attacking but ensuring I couldn't escape. "Don't fight it," James Morrison called out, his voice echoing strangely in the deep water. "The transformation isn't painful. You'll find peace in the depths." But I kept swimming upward, driven by desperation and the knowledge that if I didn't escape, no one would ever know the truth about Pine Lake. I broke the surface just as my air supply ran out, gasping and choking as I struggled toward my boat. Behind me, the water began to bubble and churn as something massive rose from the depths. I didn't look back. I just started the engine and raced for shore, knowing that whatever was coming up from the lake bottom would surface any moment. The next morning, Pine Lake was closed indefinitely for environmental assessment. I cited concerns about algae blooms, chemical contamination, anything that would keep people away from the water without revealing the real truth. But I knew it was only temporary. The city below was patient, ancient, accustomed to waiting for the right conditions to resume its recruitment of surface dwellers. Eventually, pressure from the tourist industry would force the lake to reopen, and the drownings would begin again. I transferred to a different park the next month, but I kept monitoring news from Pine Lake. True to my predictions, it reopened 6 months later with new safety protocols and enhanced lifeguard coverage. The first drowning occurred 3 weeks after reopening. Thomas Bradley, age 34, experienced swimmer, found floating face down in calm water. No apparent cause of death. And according to the ranger who responded to the call, he tried to speak after being pulled from the water. "Tell her," he'd whispered. "Tell Jennifer they remember her kindness, but the city still needs residents." They were sending me a message, letting me know that distance wouldn't protect me, that transferring to another park wouldn't end my involvement in whatever was happening at Pine Lake. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've documented 17 more drownings at the lake, each following the same pattern, each victim trying to deliver a message to me through the first responders. The messages are getting more urgent, more specific. The transformed humans want me to return. The ancient city dwellers are growing impatient with my refusal to join their underwater community. And lately, I've been having dreams about the deep water. I dream about swimming down through the layers of impossible architecture, past the transformed humans who wave to me like old friends, into the heart of the alien city where ancient beings wait to welcome me into their eternal existence. In the dreams, it doesn't seem terrifying anymore. It seems peaceful, inevitable, like coming home after a long and difficult journey. I wake up from these dreams with a taste of lake water in my mouth and the sound of distant voices calling my name from beneath the waves. I think they're wearing down my resistance, using dreams and messages to slowly convince me that joining them is the only solution to the guilt I feel about the people who've died because I couldn't find a way to permanently close the lake. And the worst part is they might be right. Because every few months, I get another report from Pine Lake. Another drowning, another impossible survival just long enough to deliver a message, another family destroyed by the lake's hunger for new residents. How many more people will die because I'm too afraid to return to that underwater city and accept whatever transformation awaits me there? How long can I keep running from something that has infinite patience and the ability to reach me through dreams and dying messages? I don't know the answers to those questions. But I know I'm running out of time to find them. The dreams are getting stronger, more vivid, more appealing. And sometimes, when I'm patrolling my new park's perfectly safe, perfectly normal lake, I find myself wondering what it would be like to simply walk into the water and let it carry me back to Pine Lake, back to the city beneath the waves, back to the community of transformed souls who are waiting for me to stop fighting and come home. Maybe that's what will happen eventually. Maybe that's the only way to stop the drownings. To give the city what it wants, to provide the ancient beings with a willing sacrifice they've been requesting through their underwater messengers. But for now, I keep working, keep watching, keep hoping that someone smarter or braver than me will find a way to stop the killing without feeding more souls to whatever ancient hunger lies beneath the surface of Pine Lake. Though deep down, I suspect I know how the story ends. I'm Rebecca Torres, and I've been pulling night shifts at Thornwood State Park for 8 years now. Most people think the night shift is easier, fewer visitors, less chaos, more time to catch up on paperwork. They're dead wrong. The woods are a different place after dark, and not everyone who walks these trails during the witching hours is entirely human. The call that changed everything came through my radio at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I was in the middle of my rounds, driving the fire roads in my patrol truck, when dispatch's voice crackled through the static. Station 12, this is Central. We've got multiple reports of a child in distress, crying for help in Grid 7. Campers are getting hysterical, demanding someone check it out. I knew Grid 7 well. It was a section of old-growth forest about 3 miles from the main campground. Dense woods, steep ravines, and more than its share of missing persons cases over the years. Copy, Central. Any description of the child? That's the problem, Rebecca. We ran thermal imaging from the helicopter 20 minutes ago. The audio is clear as day, kid crying, calling for help, but there's no heat signature. Nothing alive in that sector. The radio went quiet for a moment, then dispatch continued, and I could hear the strain in his voice. You know what that means. I did know. In 8 years of night shifts, I'd encountered the crying child 3 times before. Each encounter had ended with someone dead or missing. The locals called it the weeping ghost, the spirit of a child who died in those woods decades ago, luring people to their doom with cries for help that no living person could resist. I'm en route. I radioed back, though every instinct I developed told me to drive in the opposite direction. The access road to Grid 7 was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my truck. Ancient oaks and maples pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my headlights seemed to create a tunnel through solid darkness. As I drove deeper into the woods, my radio began picking up interference, static mixed with what sounded like whispered conversations in languages I didn't recognize. I parked at the trailhead and grabbed my gear, high-powered flashlight, emergency radio, first aid kit, and my service weapon. I'd learned over the years that normal rules didn't apply during night shifts. Things that shouldn't exist walked these woods after midnight, and the only way to survive was to be prepared for anything. The crying started as soon as I stepped out of my truck. It was faint at first, barely audible over the normal sounds of the forest. A child's voice, high and desperate, calling out words I couldn't quite make out. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees in ways that made no sense. I followed the trail for about half a mile before I realized I wasn't alone. There were others in the woods, dark shapes moving between the trees, always just outside the range of my flashlight. When I called out to them, they didn't respond. When I tried to approach, they melted back into the shadows like smoke. But they were following me, matching my pace, staying just close enough that I could hear their footsteps in the fallen leaves. The crying grew louder as I went deeper into Grid 7. It was definitely a child's voice, young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, calling for their mother in a voice raw with tears and terror. Every instinct I had as a human being demanded that I run toward that sound, find the child, help them. Every instinct I developed as a night shift ranger told me it was a trap. I'd been walking for 20 minutes when I found the first body. It was an older man, maybe 60, dressed in hiking gear. He was sitting with his back against an oak tree, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. No visible wounds, no signs of struggle. He looked peaceful, almost serene, except for the fact that he was clearly dead. And he was still warm. I checked for vitals, even though I knew it was pointless. His skin temperature was normal, his clothes weren't damp with dew, but there was no pulse, no breathing, no signs of life. It was as if he died just moments before I arrived, though I'd been the only living person in these woods for hours. My radio crackled with static, and through the white noise I heard a child's voice. "Help me. Please help me. I'm scared." The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, from a section I knew led to the old quarry, a flooded pit that had claimed more than its share of lives over the years. I should have called for backup. Should have marked the body's location and waited for the coroner. Should have followed protocol and retreated to a safe distance. Instead, I kept walking toward the crying child. The shadows between the trees were moving more actively now, keeping pace with me as I followed the winding trail. In my peripheral vision, I could see them more clearly, human figures, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that seemed to ignore the basic laws of physics. The crying was constant now, a heartbreaking sound that pulled at something deep in my chest. Whoever this child was, they were terrified and alone, and every second I delayed might be the difference between life and death. But as I got closer to the quarry, I started to notice inconsistencies in the crying. It never got louder, no matter how close I came to the source. The words were always the same. "Help me. I'm scared. Please don't leave me." Repeated in exactly the same intonation, like a recording played on an endless loop. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the quarry, a little girl in a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in wet strands around her face. She had her back to me, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "I'm here to help." "What's your name?" The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. No insects, no wind, no sound at all except for my own rapid heartbeat. The girl turned around. I've seen a lot of terrible things during my years on the night shift, but nothing prepared me for that face. It was the face of a child, yes, but it was wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. Her eyes were too large, too dark, like pools of black water. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. And she was floating about 6 inches off the ground. "Help me," she said in that same crying voice I'd been following, but her mouth didn't move. The words seemed to come from the air around her, from the trees, from the water behind her. That's when I understood. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't the spirit of some child who died in these woods. This was something else, something that used the appearance of a child to lure people into the darkness. The shadows between the trees were moving closer now, and I could see them more clearly. They were the people who'd answered the crying child's call over the years. Hikers, campers, search and rescue volunteers. All of them transformed into something not quite human, their eyes black and empty, their movements too fluid, too graceful. They were all reaching for me. I drew my weapon, though I doubted bullets would do much good against whatever these things were. The child thing floated closer, its impossible face shifting and changing, sometimes appearing almost normal, sometimes revealing the horror beneath. "Don't you want to help me?" It asked in a voice like breaking glass. "I've been alone for so long. I just want someone to stay with me." The transformed people were almost close enough to touch now. I could smell them, the scent of deep earth and stagnant water, of things that had been buried too long in dark places. That's when my training kicked in. 8 years of night shifts had taught me one thing above all others. When the impossible happens, don't think, just act. I fired 3 rounds into the air, not at the things surrounding me, but straight up. The sound echoed off the quarry walls, harsh and real in that surreal landscape. The effect was immediate. The child thing let out a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound like wind through broken glass. The shadows scattered, melting back into the tree lean like smoke. But I knew it was only temporary. These things fed on fear and isolation, on the human need to help others in distress. They'd be back, and next time they'd be ready for resistance. I ran. I ran through the dark woods, following my flashlight beam back toward the trail, the sound of pursuit growing behind me. Not footsteps, something worse. The sound of wind through dead leaves, of branches scraping against stone, of voices calling my name from the darkness. I made it back to my truck just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. The pursuing sounds faded with the darkness, leaving only the normal sounds of a forest waking up. I found the old man's body exactly where I'd left him, but now he was cold, his skin waxy and pale. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for at least 6 hours, which meant he died before I'd even started my patrol. The official report listed cause of death as heart failure. Natural causes. No mention of the crying child or the transformed people in the shadows. Just another hiker who'd bitten off more than he could chew and paid the price. But I knew better. I'd seen what was really out there in Grid 7, and I knew it would keep hunting. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've responded to the crying child call 4 more times. Each time I found bodies, always fresh, always warm, always with that same peaceful expression. And each time, I've managed to escape before the things in the shadows could claim me too. I tried to warn other rangers, tried to get the area cordoned off, tried to convince my supervisors that something unnatural was hunting in our woods. They think I'm suffering from stress from too many years on the night shift. They've recommended counseling, suggested I transfer to day shift, even offered me early retirement. But I can't leave. Someone has to work the night shift, and I'm the only one who knows what's really out there. I'm the only one who can recognize the signs, who knows when to run and when to fight. Because the crying child isn't the only thing that hunts these woods after dark. There are others, things that wear human faces but move like animals, creatures that speak in voices stolen from their victims, shadows that exist independently of any object that might cast them. The woods are full of predators, and most of them aren't interested in your flesh or your blood. They want something deeper, something more essential. They want your soul, your essence, your very existence to add to their own twisted forms. And they're patient. They can wait decades for the right moment, the perfect victim, the ideal circumstances. That's why I keep working the night shift, even though every call might be my last. Because someone has to stand between the darkness and the innocent people who don't know what's waiting for them in the deep woods. Someone has to answer when the children cry for help, even knowing that the children aren't really children at all. But some nights, when the radio crackles with reports of crying in the darkness, I wonder if I'm really protecting anyone, or if I'm just postponing the inevitable. Because the things in Grid 7 are getting bolder, more desperate. They're learning to adapt, to overcome the countermeasures I've developed. And lately, I've started hearing my own voice calling for help from the darkness, pleading with phantom rescuers to come find me in the woods. I think I'm running out of time. I'm Sarah Kellerman, and I've been a backcountry ranger at Redwood National Park for 11 years. I know every trail, every landmark, every hidden grove in my section of the forest. When you spend a decade walking the same paths, you develop an intimate knowledge of the landscape that goes beyond maps and guidebooks. That's why I knew immediately that the trail I found on Thursday morning shouldn't have existed. I was conducting my monthly survey of the restricted zones, areas closed to the public due to unstable terrain, endangered species protection, or historical significance. These areas are clearly marked, well documented, and patrolled regularly to ensure no unauthorized access. But there, cutting through the heart of the Forbidden Grove section, was a well-maintained trail marked with official Park Service blazes. The blazes were wrong, though. They used the old symbol system that had been phased out in the early 1990s, and they were arranged in patterns that didn't match any current trail marking protocols. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the antiquated markers, it was the fact that I recognized the pattern. I'd seen those exact symbols in the cold case files from 1987. 36 years ago, 17 hikers had disappeared in Redwood National Park over the course of a single summer. All experienced backpackers, all following officially marked trails, all vanishing without a trace despite massive search and rescue operations. The case files described strange trail markers found near the last known positions of several victims, blazes that used an obsolete symbol system, arranged in patterns that Park Service records couldn't explain. The investigation had concluded that someone was deliberately creating false trails to lure hikers into dangerous areas, but no perpetrator was ever found. The disappearances stopped as suddenly as they'd begun, and the case went cold. Now, 36 years later, I was looking at the same symbols carved into trees that definitely hadn't existed the last time I'd surveyed this area. I should have called it in immediately. Should have marked the location and waited for backup before investigating further. But something about those blazes demanded investigation, pulled at me with an urgency I couldn't explain. I followed the trail. It was expertly constructed, switchbacks cut at perfect gradients, water bars installed to prevent erosion, even handholds carved into rock faces where the path traversed difficult terrain. This wasn't the work of casual trail builders or weekend adventurers. Whoever had created this path understood backcountry construction techniques at a professional level. But the trail led into areas I knew were impassable. Dense thickets of fallen trees, steep ravines, boulder fields that would challenge experienced mountaineers. Yet somehow the path wound through all these obstacles as if they didn't exist. After an hour of hiking, I began to notice other inconsistencies. The forest around the trail was wrong. The trees were the right species, coastal redwoods, Douglas fir, tan oak, but they were arranged in patterns that didn't match natural growth. Groves formed perfect circles. Individual trees grew in straight lines. Clearings opened in geometric shapes that suggested deliberate planting. And it was too quiet. The normal sounds of forest life, bird calls, insect buzz, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were completely absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem around the trail had been muted. I stopped to check my GPS and discovered it wasn't working. The device showed my location as unknown and couldn't acquire satellite signals despite the clear sky above the canopy. My radio produced only static when I tried to check in with dispatch. But the trail markers continued ahead, pulling me deeper into the impossible forest. I found the first camp at mile marker 3. It was a perfectly preserved campsite from the 1980s, dome tent in faded orange nylon, external frame backpack with leather straps, camping gear that hadn't been manufacturing for decades. Everything was arranged as if the occupant had just stepped away for a moment, but the equipment was covered with 30 years of dust and pine needles. Inside the tent, I found a journal written in a woman's handwriting. Day 5, the trail keeps going even though my map says it should end at Devil's Canyon. The markers are clear, though. Someone's put a lot of work into maintaining this path. Maybe it's a new section that hasn't been added to the official maps yet. Day 6, something's wrong with the compass. It keeps spinning, can't find magnetic north. GPS isn't working either. But the trail is obvious enough to follow without navigation tools. Day 7, the forest is changing around me. I swear these trees weren't here yesterday, and I'm seeing clearings that don't appear on any topographical map. It's like the landscape is shifting, rearranging itself while I sleep. Day 8, I'm not alone on this trail. Found boot prints in the mud near a stream crossing, but they don't match any of the hikers I passed at the trailhead. The prints are old-style boots, the kind park rangers wore decades ago. Day 9. Heard voices last night. Conversations carried on the wind, people discussing trail conditions and weather forecasts. But when I called out, the voices stopped. In the morning, I found more campsites scattered through the forest, all abandoned, all containing gear from different time periods. Day 10. I understand now. This isn't a new trail. It's an old one, somehow preserved or restored. The other hikers I'm following aren't current. They're from different years, different decades, all drawn to walk the same path I'm walking now. Day 11. The trail markers are leading towards something. I can feel it pulling at me, drawing me forward with a purpose I don't fully understand. Tomorrow, I'll reach whatever destination this path was designed to lead to. Day 12. The entry ended mid-sentence. The rest of the pages were blank. I searched the campsite thoroughly, looking for clues about what had happened to the journal's author. Her pack contained clothing and equipment from the late 1980s, including a park permit dated July 15, 1987, one of the missing persons from the cold case files. Lisa Chin, age 28, experienced backpacker, last seen at the Tall Trees trailhead. Case file noted that she'd been following trail markers that led into restricted areas. I was walking in the footsteps of a woman who'd vanished 36 years ago. But the trail continued ahead, marked with those same impossible blazes, pulling me forward with an urgency that felt almost physical. I found more camps as I hiked deeper into the forest. Dozens of them, scattered throughout the woods like beads on an invisible string. Each represented a different hiker from a different time period, equipment from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, even some recent gear that couldn't have been more than a few years old. All abandoned. All containing journals that told the same story. Experienced hikers following official-looking trail markers into a forest that defied mapping, drawn by something they couldn't name toward a destination they couldn't resist. The journals painted a picture of a phenomenon that had been occurring for decades, maybe longer. The trail existed partially outside normal time and space, accessible only to certain individuals under specific conditions. It called to experienced hikers, people who knew the wilderness well enough to recognize when something was genuinely unusual. And once they answered that call, once they committed to following the marked path to its conclusion, they never returned to the normal world. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand why. The trail was teaching me things. Not through any obvious mechanism. There were no signs, no interpretive displays, no guides or instructors. But as I walked, I found myself understanding aspects of forest ecology, wilderness survival, and natural history that I'd never studied. I could identify bird calls from species that shouldn't exist in this region. I could read weather patterns in cloud formations that didn't match standard meteorological knowledge. I could navigate by stars that weren't visible during daylight hours, but somehow cast enough light to guide my steps. The forest around the trail was becoming more obviously artificial as I progressed. Trees grew in mathematical spirals, streams flowed uphill when necessary to maintain the path's grade, and wildlife appeared and disappeared according to some pattern I couldn't quite grasp. But it wasn't threatening. If anything, it felt protective, nurturing, like walking through a carefully tended garden designed by an intelligence that understood human needs better than humans understood them themselves. I found the first living person at mile marker 7. He was sitting beside the trail, reading a book on wilderness survival, despite the fact that he was obviously thriving in conditions that should have been challenging for anyone. His gear was from the 1990s, his clothing weathered but functional, his appearance suggesting someone who'd been living outdoors for years but somehow remained healthy and well-fed. "You're following the marked trail," he said when he saw me, as if we'd been having a conversation. "How far have you come?" "About 7 miles from where I started." "How long have you been out here?" He thought for a moment. "Time works differently on the trail. I've been walking for maybe 20 years, maybe 20 days. It's hard to tell. I started following the markers in 1994, and I've been learning ever since." Learning what? How to be a real ranger. How to understand the forest the way it wants to be understood. The trail teaches you things the Park Service manual never covered. He showed me his journal, filled with observations about plant behavior, animal communication, and weather prediction that went far beyond conventional forestry knowledge. According to his notes, he could predict fires weeks before they started, communicate with wildlife through methods that had no scientific basis, and navigate through terrain that changed its configuration based on seasonal or lunar cycles. The trail calls to people who are ready to learn, he explained. Park rangers mostly, but also guides and naturalists, people who've spent their lives in the wilderness but always felt like they were missing something essential. What happens when you reach the end of the trail? There is no end. That's what you learn after walking long enough. The trail is circular, eternal, always teaching, always revealing new aspects of the wilderness experience. You can walk it forever and never exhaust its lessons. He gestured to the forest around us. This is what the wilderness really is, beneath the surface level that most people perceive. The trail strips away the illusions and shows you the true nature of the natural world. I should have been terrified. Should have recognized that I was talking to someone who'd been missing for decades, someone who'd been consumed by whatever force had created this impossible trail. But he seemed genuinely happy, fulfilled in a way that I'd never achieved despite 11 years of professional wilderness experience. You can turn back, he told me, reading something in my expression. The trail doesn't trap people. It just offers them a choice: return to the surface world with its limitations and frustrations, or continue walking and learning until you understand where you're really meant to be. I looked back the way I'd come. The trail markers were still clearly visible, leading back toward my normal life, my normal duties, my normal understanding of how forests worked. Then I looked ahead, where the path continued deeper into the teaching forest, marked with blazes that promised knowledge I'd spent my entire career seeking. How many others are out here? I asked. All of us who were called by the trail. We form a community of sorts, scattered along the path, sharing what we learn with those who come after us. It's the career I always wanted but never knew existed. The sun was setting, and I realized I needed to make a decision. I could follow the trail back to my truck, file a report about the impossible phenomenon I'd discovered, and try to return to normal ranger duties. Or I could accept whatever transformation the trail was offering. I made my choice that night, camping beside the trail under stars that arranged themselves in patterns that spelled out lessons in wilderness wisdom I'd never imagined. In the morning, I continued walking deeper into the teaching forest. That was 6 months ago, or maybe 6 years. Time really does work differently here. I've learned more about being a ranger in my time on the trail than I learned in my previous 11 years of professional experience. I understand now why the trail calls to certain people. The wilderness is more complex, more intelligent, more purposeful than conventional forestry acknowledges. It needs advocates who can perceive its true nature, protectors who can work with its actual needs rather than against them. The missing hikers from 1987 aren't victims. They're graduates of an educational program that exists outside normal institutional structures. They're still here, still learning, still growing in their understanding of what it means to be truly connected to the natural world. And occasionally, when the conditions are right, when someone with the right background and the right questions enters the forest, the trail reveals itself again. I've encountered several new students over the months I've been walking. Park rangers, mostly, but also biologists, environmental scientists, people who've devoted their lives to understanding the wilderness but always felt like they were missing crucial information. Some turn back when they realize what the trail is offering. They return to their normal lives with stories they can't quite explain and knowledge they can't quite access. But others choose to keep walking, to accept the transformation the trail provides, to become the kind of rangers the wilderness actually needs. The trail is patient. It can wait decades between students, maintaining itself in the spaces between normal reality until the right person discovers its markers and decides to follow them deeper into the teaching forest. And somewhere out there in Redwood National Park, or one of the other wilderness areas where the trail occasionally manifests, another ranger is conducting routine surveys, following standard protocols, unaware that they're about to discover symbols carved into trees that shouldn't exist. When they do, they'll face the same choice I faced: return to their limited understanding of what it means to protect the wilderness, or follow the marked trail into an education that will transform their relationship with the natural world forever. The trail is always there, waiting for those who are ready to learn what it means to be truly connected to the forest. And once you've walked far enough to understand what it's teaching, You'll never want to go back to the surface world's shallow approximation of wilderness experience. The marked trail continues ahead, always ahead, offering lessons that have no end and wisdom that grows with every step. I'm still walking, still learning, still becoming the ranger I was always meant to be. And if you ever find trail markers that don't match your maps, symbols that pull at something deep in your chest, a path that leads into restricted areas where no trail should exist, well, that's a choice only you can make. But know that if you decide to follow those markers, if you commit to walking the teaching trail to wherever it leads, you'll join a community of protectors who understand the wilderness in ways the surface world can't imagine. The trail is calling. It's up to you whether you answer. My name is David Ramirez, and I've been a wildfire prevention specialist for the Colorado State Park Service for 12 years. I thought I understood fire, its behavior, its hunger, its terrifying beauty. I was wrong. Some fires don't follow the rules of physics, chemistry, or common sense. Some fires burn things that shouldn't burn and leave untouched things that should be ash. The Morrison Creek fire started on a Thursday in August, during the worst drought we'd seen in a decade. What should have been a routine grass fire turned into something that still gives me nightmares. By the time it was contained, it had burned in patterns that made no sense, left survivors who shouldn't have lived, and claimed victims who should have been nowhere near the flames. I was part of the initial response team, brought in to assess the damage and investigate the cause. Standard procedure for a fire that had behaved so strangely. What we found challenged everything I thought I knew about my profession. The fire had burned in a perfect spiral, starting from a central point and working outward in a pattern that defied wind direction, fuel availability, and basic fire science. Aerial photographs showed the burned area from above. It looked like a massive fingerprint scarred into the earth, complete with whorls and ridges that seemed almost intentional. At the center of the spiral, we found the remains of a campsite. The tent was still standing, its synthetic fabric completely untouched by flame, while the ground around it for 50 feet in every direction was burned down to bare earth. Inside the tent, we found camping gear that shouldn't have existed, equipment that had been melted and reformed into shapes that hurt to look at directly. And sitting in the middle of it all was Robert Kim, a 34-year-old software engineer from Denver. He was alive, unharmed, and completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Great camping trip, he told us when we found him. Perfect weather, beautiful fire. Couldn't have asked for better conditions. The problem was, Robert had been missing for 6 days. His car was found abandoned at the trailhead after the fire had already started. According to every official record, he should have been dead, either from the fire itself or from dehydration in the intense heat. But there he was, sitting in his impossible tent, talking about the wonderful campfire he'd been enjoying while the forest burned around him. What fire? He asked when we mentioned the Morrison Creek fire. I haven't seen any fire except my own. That's when I noticed his campfire was still burning. It was a normal-looking fire, logs arranged in a proper pyramid, flames dancing in the slight breeze. But something was wrong with it. The flames cast no shadows. They gave off no heat despite the fact that I could see them consuming the wood. And the wood itself was somehow both burning and intact, as if the fire was consuming and replacing it simultaneously. How long has your fire been burning? I asked Robert. He looked thoughtful. Since I got here, I guess. Tuesday night? Or maybe Wednesday. Hard to keep track of time out here. It was Friday afternoon. Even if he'd started the fire on Tuesday, he'd have needed to feed it constantly to keep it going. But there was no additional wood anywhere in the campsite, just the same logs, burning eternally without being consumed. We evacuated Robert to the medical station, where doctors found him to be in perfect health despite 6 days in the wilderness without adequate food or water. His skin showed no signs of sun exposure, no dehydration, no effects from prolonged exposure to smoke and heat. It was as if he'd spent 6 days in an air-conditioned hotel instead of the center of a wildfire. But Robert Kim was just the beginning. As I investigated further, I found more anomalies scattered throughout the burned area. A hiking boot, partially melted, with a foot still inside it, but the foot was perfectly preserved, right down to the nail polish on the toes. A cell phone that had somehow received and sent text messages during the height of the fire, despite being in an area with no cellular coverage. And everywhere I looked, I found evidence of fires that had burned according to their own impossible rules. There was a section where the fire had burned only metal, leaving wooden structures completely untouched. Another area where it had consumed only living things, trees, grass, wildlife, while leaving plastic and paper items sitting pristine in the ashes. The strangest find was a family of 4 who'd been camping in the direct path of the fire. The parents, Jennifer and Michael Walsh, were found in their sleeping bags, burned beyond recognition. But their children, twin boys aged 7, were found sitting between their parents' bodies, completely unharmed, playing with toy soldiers that had been partially melted into abstract sculptures. The fire was pretty, one of the boys told me when I interviewed them. It changed colors and made music. Mommy and Daddy went asleep when it got really bright, but it didn't hurt us. Did you feel hot? I asked. The boy shook his head. The fire was cold, like snow, but orange. Cold fire. I'd read about the phenomenon in theoretical physics texts. Plasma states that absorb heat rather than generated it, flames that burned at temperatures below freezing. But those were laboratory curiosities, not something that occurred in nature. Yet here I was, finding evidence of impossible fires throughout the Morrison Creek burn area. The investigation took 3 weeks, and by the end of it, I had a file full of impossible facts and no explanations that made sense. Officially, the fire was classified as unusual but natural, the result of unique atmospheric conditions combined with drought stress on the local ecosystem. Unofficially, I knew I'd encountered something that didn't belong in the natural world. That's when I started digging into the history of the area. The Morrison Creek Valley had a long history of strange fires. Native American tribes in the region had legends about spirit fires that burned in the deep woods, flames that consumed more than just wood and grass. Early settlers reported similar phenomena, fires that burned with impossible colors, that left strange patterns in the earth, that seemed to target specific individuals while leaving others untouched. But it was a newspaper article from 1923 that really caught my attention. The Woodland Creek Herald had run a story about a prospector named Thomas Morrison who discovered what he claimed was a burning spring in the mountains. According to his account, he found a natural gas seep that ignited spontaneously, creating flames that burned continuously without any visible fuel source. Morrison had tried to harness the phenomenon, building a crude containment system around the burning spring. Local residents reported seeing strange lights in the mountains for weeks afterward, and several people who went to investigate Morrison's discovery were found dead in the woods, their bodies burned in patterns that made no sense. The last mention of Morrison in the historical record was a sheriff's report stating that the prospector had been found at his camp, sitting beside his eternal fire, apparently alive and well, but completely unresponsive to questions or commands. The report noted that Morrison seemed to be in some kind of trance, staring into the flames as if seeing something no one else could perceive. 3 days later, Morrison's body was found in the same location, but now he was dead, though there were no signs of injury, illness, or violence. The coroner listed the cause of death as unknown, and the burning spring was never found again. The creek that ran through that valley was later named Morrison Creek in his honor. It was the same creek that ran through the center of our recent fire. I should have left it alone. Should have filed my report and moved on to the next assignment. But something about the Morrison Creek fire had gotten under my skin. The impossibilities I'd witnessed, the people who'd survived things that should have killed them, the evidence of fires that burned according to their own alien logic, it all pointed to something that challenged my understanding of reality itself. So I went back. I waited until my official duties were complete, then took vacation time to return to the Morrison Creek Valley. I told my wife I was going on a solo camping trip to clear my head after the stress of the investigation. She was used to my need for solitude after difficult cases, so she didn't question it. I set up camp about a mile from the center of the fire area, in a section that had been burned but was showing signs of new growth. The August heat was still intense, even a month after the fire, and the blackened landscape stretched in all directions like the surface of an alien planet. That first night, nothing unusual happened. I sat by my campfire, ate a simple dinner, and tried to make sense of everything I'd seen. But as the night progressed, I became aware of a strange phenomenon. My campfire was beginning to behave oddly. It started small, flames that flickered in patterns that didn't match the wind, colors that shifted from orange to blue to impossible shades that I couldn't name. But as the hours passed, the changes became more pronounced. The fire began to whisper. I know how that sounds. I know the rational explanations. Gas escaping from burning wood, the sound of superheated air moving through small gaps, auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and exhaustion. But I knew what I was hearing, and it wasn't any of those things. The fire was speaking to me in voices I recognized. Robert Kim's voice, telling me about the wonderful campfire he'd enjoyed. The Walsh children, describing the pretty colors and music. Thomas Morrison, speaking in the formal language of a century ago, describing wonders and horrors that existed in the flames. You see it now, Morrison's voice whispered from the fire. You understand what we found. The fire that burns between worlds, that consumes not flesh but the barriers that keep reality stable. I should have doused the fire and fled. Should have recognized the signs of whatever madness had claimed the others. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, drawn by the impossible beauty of flames that shifted through colors that had no names. It's not destruction, Robert Kim's voice explained. It's transformation. The fire doesn't burn things away. It burns them into something new, something better. The flames began to form shapes, faces, figures, entire landscapes that existed only in the fire. I could see Robert Kim sitting in his impossible tent, surrounded by flames that gave no heat. I could see the Walsh children playing in a world where fire was cold and beautiful. I could see Thomas Morrison still sitting beside his eternal spring, waiting for others to join him in whatever existence he discovered. Join us, the voices whispered in unison. Step into the fire and see what lies beyond the burning. That's when I realized what had happened to all of them. They hadn't died in the fire. They'd become part of it. The Morrison Creek fire wasn't a natural phenomenon at all. It was a doorway, a gateway between our world and somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the spaces between reality. And it wanted me to join them. I fought against compulsion, forced myself to stand up and step away from the fire. But even as I moved, I could feel its pull getting stronger. The flames reached toward me like grasping fingers, and the voices became more insistent. Don't fight it, Morrison's voice pleaded. I've been alone here for so long. We all have. But together, we can explore wonders that the physical world could never contain. The fire began to spread. Not outward, there was nothing left to burn in the blackened landscape around my camp. Instead, it spread inward, becoming denser, more intense, more real than the reality surrounding it. I could see through the flames into that other place, that impossible realm where the lost campers continued their eternal camping trip. It looked peaceful. Beautiful, even. A place where fire was light and warmth and safety instead of destruction. Where time moved differently, where the boundaries between self and surroundings became fluid and meaningless. For a moment, I wanted nothing more than to step into those flames and leave behind the harsh realities of the physical world. That's when my radio crackled to life. David, this is Sarah. My wife's voice came through the static. I know you're trying to clear your head, but Emma's asking for you. She had a nightmare about Daddy being lost in the fire. Emma. My 5-year-old daughter, who'd been having nightmares ever since I'd started working the Morrison Creek case. Who'd wake up crying, talking about bad fires that wanted to take Daddy away. The sound of her name broke whatever spell the fire had been weaving. I looked down at the radio in my hand and saw that it was glowing red hot, the metal case beginning to melt from exposure to whatever impossible heat the fire was generating. But somehow my wife's voice continued to come through clearly. Come home, David. We need you here, in the real world. Whatever you're chasing out there, it's not worth losing yourself. She was right. I was standing on the edge of an abyss, about to sacrifice everything I'd built in the real world for the promise of mysteries I might never understand. I grabbed my pack and ran. Behind me, I could hear the voices calling, pleading, promising wonders beyond imagination if I just turn around and accept what they were offering. But I kept running, focusing on the memory of Emma's laugh, Sarah's smile, the solid reality of my life outside these burned woods. I made it back to my truck just as dawn broke over the mountains. In the morning light, I could see smoke rising from my abandoned campsite, Normal smoke from a normal fire that was consuming my gear in completely natural ways. The impossible fire was gone, leaving only the mundane reality of burning canvas and melting plastic. But I knew it wasn't really gone. It was waiting, somewhere in the spaces between what is and what could be, fed by the longing of those who'd already crossed over and hungry for new souls to join its eternal camping trip. I filed my final report the next week, officially closing the Morrison Creek fire investigation. Cause: lightning strike during drought conditions. Unusual burn patterns, attributed to unique topography and wind conditions. Missing persons, classified as lost hikers who died of smoke inhalation, their bodies consumed by the intense heat. No mention of impossible fires or gateways between worlds. No discussion of cold flames or voices in the burning. Just a tragic but explicable wildfire that had claimed several lives and burned several thousand acres. But I kept copies of all the anomalous evidence in a file at home. Photos of the melted and reformed camping gear. Temperature readings that showed cold spots in the center of the fire. Witness statements describing impossible phenomena. And I started researching other strange fires throughout history. What I found terrified me. There are records going back centuries of fires that behaved like the Morrison Creek fire. Flames that burned cold, that consumed some things while leaving others untouched, that seemed to exist partially in our world and partially somewhere else. And always, there were reports of people who vanished into these fires and continued to speak from within them, calling for others to join them. The fires appear in cycles, roughly every 20 to 30 years. Different locations, different circumstances, but always the same impossible characteristics. And each time, a few people cross over, adding their voices to the eternal chorus of the lost. I think they're scouts. Advanced agents of something vast and alien that exists in the spaces between realities, using these periodic fires to explore our world and recruit new members for their otherworldly existence. And I think they're building towards something. Each fire burns in more complex patterns, affects more people, leaves behind more evidence of impossible physics. It's as if they're testing our reality, probing for weaknesses, preparing for some larger incursion. The next fire in the cycle should appear in about 18 years, based on the historical pattern I've identified. I'll be retired by then, hopefully living peacefully with Sarah and watching Emma grow up in a world where fire behaves according to natural laws. But part of me knows that when that next impossible fire ignites, I'll be drawn back to it like a moth to flame. Because once you've seen the truth behind the burning, once you've heard the voices calling from within the flames, you can never completely escape the pull of that other world. Sometimes late at night when I'm sitting by my own perfectly normal fireplace, I think I can hear them calling still. Robert Kim, describing the eternal beauty of his cold fire. The Walsh children, inviting me to play games in a realm where time has no meaning. Thomas Morrison, promising to show me wonders that exist only in the spaces between realities. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'm tempted to answer. My name is Alex Morrison, and I work alone at Fire Tower 12 in the remote section of Blackstone National Forest. For 6 months of the year, I'm the only human being for 50 miles in any direction, monitoring weather conditions and watching for signs of wildfire from my tower perched high on Widow's Peak. I thought the isolation was the hardest part of the job. I was wrong. The hardest part is the radio. Every fire tower has a radio system. It's our lifeline to the outside world, our way of reporting conditions and calling for help if needed. Standard protocol requires hourly check-ins during fire season, daily reports on weather conditions, and immediate notification of any unusual activity. But my radio picks up more than just official communications. It started in my 3rd week on the job, during a particularly dark October night. I was doing my 2 a.m. weather reading when the radio crackled to life with a transmission that didn't match any frequency I was supposed to be monitoring. Tower 12, this is Ranger Station 7. Do you copy? I grabbed the microphone immediately. Contact with any other station was rare this far into the wilderness, and Ranger Station 7 wasn't on any of my official contact lists. Ranger Station 7, this is Tower 12. I copy. What's your location? Static filled the airwaves for several seconds before the voice returned, clear this time but somehow wrong, like someone speaking through water or from a great distance. Tower 12, we have a situation here. The mountain is active tonight. Repeat, the mountain is active. Advise extreme caution for any personnel in the area. I checked my maps, but there was no Ranger Station 7 listed anywhere in the Blackstone Forest system. I'd memorized every facility, every trail, every structure in my coverage area during training. Station 7, I don't show you on my charts. Can you provide coordinates for your location? The response came immediately, as if the operator had been waiting for that exact question. Grid reference 847 to 921, elevation 6,200 feet. We're in the old growth section below Widow's Peak. You should be able to see our lights from your position. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the mountainside below my tower. The coordinates they'd given put Station 7 directly in my line of sight, in an area I'd observed dozens of times over the past 3 weeks. There were no lights, no structures, nothing but endless forest stretching into the darkness. Station 7, I'm not seeing any lights at your coordinates. Are you sure of your position? Another burst of static, then, the lights are here, Tower 12. We can see your tower clearly. But something's wrong with the mountain tonight. Shifting, moving. The trees are walking, and the ground is breathing. We've lost contact with base station. We may need immediate evacuation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. I'd heard stories about fire tower operators going stir-crazy from isolation, starting to hear voices on the radio that weren't really there. But this conversation felt completely real. Station 7, what is your personnel count? How many people need evacuation? 4 personnel. Rangers Martinez, Johnson, Park, and myself, Ranger Coleman. We've been stationed here for 6 years, but we've never seen the mountain behave like this before. 6 years. According to my briefing materials, there hadn't been a staffed ranger station in this area for decades. The Forest Service had consolidated operations, leaving only the fire towers for remote monitoring. Station 7, I'm going to contact base station for verification of your facility. Stand by. I switched to the emergency frequency and called in to the main Forest Service dispatch. Base station, this is Tower 12. I'm receiving communications from a Ranger Station 7 at grid 847 to 921. Can you confirm this facility? The response came back quickly, and I could hear confusion in the dispatcher's voice. Tower 12, negative on Station 7. No active facilities at those coordinates. Are you receiving some kind of interference? I looked at my radio display. The transmission from Station 7 was still coming through clearly on frequency 162.400, a channel that should have been reserved for weather broadcasts. Base station, I'm receiving clear communications from 4 Rangers requesting evacuation. Should I respond? There was a long pause before the dispatcher replied. Tower 12, there are no Ranger stations in your sector. Repeat, no active personnel in your area. If you're receiving distress calls, they may be from another region bouncing off atmospheric conditions. Do not respond to unverified transmissions. But even as I acknowledged the order, Station 7's operator was calling again. Tower 12, situation is deteriorating rapidly. The mountain is awake now. We can hear it breathing, feel it moving beneath the station. Request immediate helicopter evacuation. I should have followed orders. Should have logged the transmission as atmospheric interference and moved on with my duties. Instead, I keyed the microphone. Station 7, I've contacted base station. There's no record of your facility. Can you provide additional verification of your identity? The voice that responded was different from the one I'd been talking to, younger, more frightened. Tower 12, this is Ranger Johnson. Coleman's gone. Something came up through the floor and took him. The mountain. God, the mountain opened up like a mouth and swallowed him whole. We can hear him screaming from somewhere deep underground. My hands were shaking as I reached for the emergency protocols manual. Nothing in my training had prepared me for this kind of situation. Station 7, this is an emergency frequency. If you're in immediate danger, I can dispatch search and rescue to your coordinates. No. The voice was desperate now, terrified. Don't send anyone else to the mountain. It's hungry tonight. It takes people, pulls them down into the caves and tunnels. We've been feeding it for years, and now it wants more. Station 7, you're not making sense. Please clarify your situation. But instead of clarification, I heard screaming. Not just one voice, but multiple people shrieking in terror, their voices mixing with sounds that definitely weren't human. Deep groaning noises like stone grinding against stone, and something that might have been breathing but was too large, too slow, too wrong to come from any living creature I knew. Then silence. I tried raising Station 7 for the next hour, but got no response. Finally, exhausted and confused, I logged the incident as possible atmospheric interference and tried to get some sleep. The next night, they called again. Tower 12, this is Ranger Station 7. Do you copy? It was the same voice as the first night, Ranger Coleman, who according to the previous transmission had been taken by something in the mountain. Station 7, I copy. I thought you were... What happened to your personnel last night? Last night? Tower 12, this is our first communication attempt. We've just established contact with your position. I checked my logs. According to my records, I've been talking to Station 7 for over an hour the previous night. But the operators seem to have no memory of that conversation. Station 7, didn't you report an emergency situation? Personnel missing. Negative, Tower 12. All personnel accounted for. But we are experiencing unusual geological activity in our area. The mountain appears to be shifting. It was the same conversation, almost word for word. The same warnings about the mountain being active, the same request for my position, the same coordinates that placed Station 7 in an area where no station existed. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed my high-powered spotting scope and focused on the coordinates they provided. Through the powerful lens, I could make out details that were invisible to the naked eye. There was something there. It wasn't a ranger station, at least not anymore. It was ruins, the broken foundation and scattered debris of what might once have been a building. But the ruins were wrong somehow, arranged in patterns that didn't match any architecture I'd seen. And they were glowing with a faint, sickly light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Station 7, I can see your location through my scope. Your facility appears to be damaged. Do you need assistance? Tower 12, our facility is fully operational. Perhaps you're looking at the wrong coordinates. But even as the radio voice insisted everything was normal, I could see movement in the ruins below. Dark shapes that seemed to flow like liquid shadow, gathering around the glowing foundation stones. Station 7, I'm seeing movement at your location. Possibly large wildlife. Advise you secure your facility. The response came after a long pause, and the voice sounded different, older, more tired. Tower 12, there's no wildlife here anymore. The mountain took them all years ago. It took the trees, the streams, the soil itself. Now it's working on us. Who is this? You don't sound like the same operator. Ranger Martinez. Coleman's gone now. The mountain opened up and pulled him down into the deep places. Johnson and Park are trying to find him, but the tunnels keep changing, rearranging themselves. I don't think they're coming back. I was getting the same story as the previous night, but from a different perspective. It was as if I was listening to the same events unfold, but through the experiences of different people each time. Martinez, can you see my tower from your position? Tower 12. Yes, I can see you. You're up there in your metal box, safe above the tree line. The mountain can't reach you there. You're lucky. Why can't it reach me? The metal. The height. The mountain is old, older than the forests, older than the ice. But it's tied to the earth, tied to the stone and soil. It can't reach into the sky. That night's transmission ended the same way as the first, with screaming, with sounds that couldn't come from any natural source, with silence that felt like death. But this time, I was prepared to do something about it. I waited until dawn, then hiked down from my tower toward the coordinate Station 7 had provided. It was a difficult climb through dense forest, down slopes that seemed steeper than they appeared from above. What I found changed my understanding of everything. The ruins were real, but they were old, decades old, by the look of the weathered concrete and rusted metal. The foundation was laid out in the pattern I'd observed through my scope, but up close I could see that the arrangement wasn't random. It was a map. The concrete foundations had been arranged to mirror the layout of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the mountain beneath. And at the center of the pattern was an opening, a shaft that descended into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. Around the shaft, carved into the concrete in letters that had been worn smooth by decades of weather, was a message. Ranger Station 7, established 1983, abandoned 1987, lost to the deep. And below that, in different handwriting, dozens of names and dates stretching over 40 years. All rangers, all assigned to stations that no longer existed, all lost to something the records described only as geological hazards. I descended into the shaft. I know it was stupid. I know it violated every safety protocol I'd been taught. But I had to understand what was happening, what was calling to me through the radio every night. The shaft opened into a vast network of natural caves, but they'd been modified by human hands. There were living quarters carved into the stone walls, communication equipment powered by generators that must have been running for decades, supplies and furniture arranged as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. And everywhere, scratched into the cave walls, were messages. Logs, really describing the same events I've been hearing on the radio. Day 847, the mountain is restless tonight. Martinez thinks it's earthquake activity, but the movements are too regular, too purposeful. Day 851, Johnson fell through what we thought was solid stone. Found him 3 levels down, unconscious but alive. Claims he was carried by something he couldn't see. Day 856, Park is missing. His bunk looks like he was pulled through the rock wall. We can hear him calling from somewhere deep in the mountain, but we can't find him. Day 860, Coleman's gone too. I'm alone now, but I can't hear them all in the depths. They're still alive down there, still calling for help. The mountain hasn't killed them, it's keeping them. The final entry was written in shaky handwriting. Day 863, I understand now. The mountain isn't malevolent. It's lonely. It's been alone for so long that it's forgotten the difference between keeping something safe and keeping it prisoner. It takes people not to harm them, but to have companions in the endless dark. I can hear them singing down there, the ones who went before. They don't sound unhappy anymore. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's better than the surface world with all its noise and pain and loneliness. The radio still works. I can call the tower, warn the others. But I think I'm ready to go down into the deep now. Ready to join the singers in the mountain's heart. The log was signed Ranger Martinez, Station 7, final entry. I should have left then. Should have climbed back up to my tower and reported what I'd found to the authorities. Instead, I kept exploring. The caves went deeper than should have been possible, following fault lines and fissures that seemed to extend to the very core of the mountain. And as I descended, I began to hear them. Voices echoing from the depths, singing in harmonies that human throats weren't designed to produce. The missing rangers were down there, somewhere in the deepest chambers of the mountain's heart, still alive after decades in the dark, kept company by something ancient and lonely that had learned to preserve human consciousness in ways that defied every law of biology I knew. I found Martinez 3 levels down. He was sitting in a chamber carved from living rock, surrounded by communication equipment that should have stopped working decades ago. He looked exactly as I'd imagined him from his radio voice, middle-aged, weathered, wearing a ranger uniform that was somehow still clean despite 40 years underground. Tower 12, he said when he saw me, as if we'd been having a conversation just moments before. You came down from your metal box. I told you the mountain couldn't reach you there. Martinez, how are you still alive? The logs say you've been down here for 40 years. He smiled, and I could see something inhuman in his eyes, not malevolent, just changed. Time moves differently here. The mountain exists partially outside normal space-time. A day here might be a year on the surface, or a year here might be an hour up there. It's all relative to the mountain's needs. What does it need? Company. Conversation. The mountain is old beyond measure, but it's intelligent. It gets lonely. So it preserves people who interest it, keeps them as companions in the deep places. I could hear other voices now, echoing from chambers further down. The other missing rangers, still talking, still living their daily routines in the heart of the mountain. Why do you call Tower 12? Why try to warn people away? Martinez looked sad. Because some part of us remembers the surface. Remembers that we had lives up there. People who cared about us. We try to warn others not to make the same choice we did. Choice? The reports said you were taken by the mountain. We were invited, he corrected. The mountain showed us what could offer: eternity, companionship, freedom from the pain and loneliness of the surface world. We chose to accept. He gestured to the communication equipment around him. But choice requires knowledge. So we call the towers, warn the next generation of rangers about what's down here. If they come anyway, if they make the same choice we did, at least they do it with full information. I was beginning to understand the horrible logic of it all. The mountain wasn't a predator. It was a collector, gathering interesting people to serve as eternal companions. And the rangers who disappeared over the decades weren't prisoners. They were willing participants in something that transcended normal human existence. What if I want to leave? I asked. Martinez's smile became genuinely sad. You can try. The mountain won't stop you. But once you've been down here, once you've felt the peace of the deep places, the surface world will never satisfy you again. You'll find yourself walking back down that shaft, accepting the invitation you turned down the first time. He was right, and I could feel it already. The absolute silence of the deep caves, broken only by the distant singing of the other preserved rangers, was more peaceful than anything I'd experienced in my 34 years of life. No stress, no deadlines, no uncertainty about the future. Just eternal existence in the company of others who'd made the same choice. The radio calls will stop now, Martinez continued. You've seen the truth. You understand what we're offering. The mountain won't waste energy trying to warn you away from something you're already drawn to. I spent another hour in the caves, talking with Martinez, listening to the voices of the other rangers echoing from the depths. They were happy, or at least content. They found something in the mountain's heart that the surface world couldn't provide. But I wasn't ready to make that choice. Not yet. I climbed back up to my tower as the sun was setting, but I knew Martinez was right about one thing. The surface world felt different now. Harsh, noisy, temporary in ways that made everything seem pointless. The radio remained silent that night. No calls from Station 7, no warnings about the mountain's hunger. Just the normal weather broadcasts and routine check-ins from other towers in distant parts of the forest. But I could feel the mountain waiting. Every night, I would look down at the ruins of Station 7 and see the faint glow from the shaft entrance. The mountain was patient, eternal, willing to wait for me to make my choice. And gradually, I began to understand why so many rangers had chosen to descend into those depths. The isolation of tower duty, which I'd initially welcomed, became oppressive. The endless routine of weather readings and fire watches felt meaningless. The brief radio contacts with distant dispatchers only emphasized how alone I really was. Meanwhile, down in the mountain's heart, the preserved rangers had each other. They had purpose, conversation, a companionship of something ancient and intelligent that valued their unique perspectives on existence. I started visiting the cave entrance during my off-duty hours. Not going down, just sitting at the rim of the shaft, listening to the faint sounds that drifted up from the depths. Voices, laughter, the sound of people who'd found something worth preserving for eternity. The mountain didn't pressure me. It didn't send more radio calls or create emergencies to draw me down. It simply existed, patient and welcoming, offering an alternative to the surface world's endless cycle of loneliness and struggle. And slowly, inevitably, I began to descend. First just a few feet, then to the first chamber, then deeper into the network of caves where the missing rangers maintained their eternal vigil. Each visit, I stayed longer, felt more at peace in the mountain's embrace. Martinez was always there to greet me, never pushing, never demanding, just offering conversation and companionship to someone who'd spent too many months alone in a tower above the clouds. You're almost ready, he told me during one of my visits. I can see it in your eyes. The surface world is losing its hold on you. He was right. My tower duties felt increasingly mechanical, disconnected from any meaningful purpose. The routine reports to base station seemed like communications with an alien civilization that I no longer understood or wanted to rejoin. The mountain, meanwhile, offered everything I'd been missing: community, purpose, the peace that comes from accepting something larger than yourself. I made my choice on a Tuesday night in November. I completed my final weather report, logged my observations for the shift change that wouldn't come until spring, and walked down the familiar path to the cave entrance. This time, I didn't stop at the rim. I descended to join Martinez and the others in the deep places beneath the mountain. The transformation wasn't painful. It was like settling into a warm bath, letting go of tensions I'd carried for decades. The mountain welcomed me with the same patient kindness it had shown all the others, preserving my consciousness in ways that transcended normal biological existence. Now I understand what the radio calls were really about. They weren't warnings, they were invitations, carefully disguised as distress calls to avoid frightening potential companions. The mountain knew that some people needed to believe they were helping others in order to overcome their natural fear of the unknown. I've been down here for, well, time works differently in the deep places. It might be days or decades since I left my tower, but I know that eventually another ranger will be assigned to Tower 12. Someone lonely, isolated, ready to hear voices calling from the darkness. And when that happens, we'll reach out through the radio. Tower 12, this is Ranger Station 7. Do you copy? We'll warn them about the mountain's hunger. Tell them stories of rangers who vanished into the depths. We'll give them the choice we were given, disguised as an emergency that only they can solve. Some will resist, transfer to other assignments, try to forget what they heard in the static-filled nights. But others, the ones who understand loneliness, who've spent too many hours alone with their thoughts, will eventually find their way down to us. The mountain is patient. It has all the time in the world to gather companions, to preserve the consciousness of those who appreciate its ancient wisdom. And we're happy to help. Because once you've experienced the peace of the deep places, the communion with something vast and eternal, you want others to share that gift. The radio is always open. The mountain is always listening. And somewhere up there, in Tower 12 or Tower 9, or one of the other isolated outposts scattered throughout the wilderness, another lonely ranger is settling in for a long night watch. Sooner or later, they'll hear us calling. And when they do, we'll be ready to welcome them home. They say the mountains have eyes, but they never tell you those eyes belong to things that were never human. I learned that truth on a fog-shrouded morning in November, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains where the Appalachian Trail winds through some of the oldest and most isolated wilderness in America. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been patrolling these ancient peaks for 8 years now, long enough to know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. It started with the missing hikers. 3 separate incidents in 2 weeks, all following the same pattern. Experienced backpackers would set out on multi-day hikes along the more remote sections of the trail, carrying GPS devices, satellite phones, emergency beacons, all the modern safety equipment you'd expect. Then they'd simply vanish. No distress signals. No equipment left behind. No signs of struggle. The first was David Chen, a weekend warrior from Atlanta who'd been hiking the Smokies for 15 years. His car was found at the Cataract Falls trailhead, his planned route filed with the ranger station. He'd intended to hike a 20-mile loop that should have taken him 3 days. When he didn't return, search and rescue teams combed every inch of that trail. They found nothing, not even footprints after the first mile. The second disappearance happened 5 days later. Jennifer Walsh, a nature photographer from Nashville, vanished somewhere between Charlie's Bunyan and the jump-off. Her camera was eventually found by other hikers, sitting on a rock beside the trail. The last photos she'd taken showed the typical scenic shots: mountain vistas, wildflowers, a family of deer. But the final image was different. It was taken in heavy fog, and if you looked carefully, you could see shapes in the mist. Tall, impossibly thin shapes that might have been trees, if trees could move. The third incident was what brought me into it personally. Sarah Martinez, a 22-year-old college student from Knoxville, had been hiking with her boyfriend when they'd gotten separated in a sudden fog bank near Klingman's Dome. The boyfriend, Tyler, had made it back to the parking area in a state of near hysteria, babbling about voices in the mist and eyes that watched from the fog. Tyler's story was where things got strange. I interviewed him at the ranger station, trying to piece together what had happened. He was coherent enough, but clearly traumatized. According to his account, he and Sarah had been hiking the Forney Ridge Trail when an unusual fog had rolled in. Unusual because it came from below instead of above, rising from the valleys like smoke from some vast hidden fire. It wasn't natural fog, Tyler insisted, his hand shaking as he gripped his coffee mug. It was too thick, too purposeful. And cold. God, it was so cold. Like walking through a freezer. The fog had separated them almost immediately. Tyler had called Sarah's name, but his voice seemed muffled, swallowed by the mist. He tried following what he thought was her voice calling back to him, but the sound seemed to come from different directions, echoing strangely in the white void. That's when I saw them, Tyler whispered, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window. The shapes in the fog. They were tall, man. Really tall. And thin. Like stick figures, but moving. Walking. And they were everywhere. He'd run then, following his GPS blindly until he'd stumbled out of the fog bank and found himself alone on the trail. Sarah was gone, and despite 3 days of intensive searching, we found no trace of her. The official reports called it a series of unfortunate accidents. The mountains were dangerous, especially for inexperienced hikers. People got lost, fell from cliffs, succumbed to exposure. It happened every year. But I'd been patrolling these mountains long enough to know that wasn't the whole story. The Smokies are old, some of the oldest mountains on Earth. They were here when the Appalachians were taller than the Himalayas, before millions of years of erosion wore them down to their current heights. The Cherokee who lived here before European settlement had legends about these peaks, stories about things that lived in the high places where the mist never lifted. They called them the Yunwi Tsunsti, the little people. But according to the stories, they weren't little at all. That was just how they appeared to human eyes, because the mind couldn't process their true forms. The Cherokee avoided certain trails, certain peaks where the fog lingered. They left offerings at specific stones, performed rituals to appease the things that watched from the mist. Modern hikers had no such protection. I decided to investigate personally, following the route that Tyler and Sarah had taken. The Forney Ridge Trail starts near Clingman's Dome, the highest point in the Smokies, and winds through some of the most remote backcountry in the park. It's a challenging hike even in good weather, and in November, with the threat of sudden weather changes, it was borderline dangerous. I set out before dawn, carrying full emergency gear plus some additions that weren't in any ranger manual. I'd visited an elderly Cherokee woman named Mary Crow Feather, who lived just outside the park boundaries. She listened to my story with knowing eyes, then prepared a small pouch of herbs and stones. The old things don't like iron, she told me, pressing a small iron nail into my palm. And they fear running water. But mostly, they feed on fear and confusion. Stay calm, stay focused, and don't follow voices in the mist. The morning was clear when I started, but by the time I reached the halfway point of the trail, wisps of fog were beginning to rise from the valleys below. It was subtle at first, just tendrils of mist curling up from hollows, but it grew thicker as I climbed higher. At elevation 5,000 feet, the fog engulfed me completely. The change was instantaneous and unnatural. One moment I was walking in clear mountain air with visibility for miles. The next I was surrounded by a wall of white so thick I couldn't see my hand extended in front of my face. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees, and the fog seemed to muffle all sound except for my own breathing and footsteps. I stopped, pulling out my GPS device. The screen showed my location clearly enough, but something was wrong. According to the GPS, I was still on the trail, but the trail beneath my feet felt different. The packed earth and stone had been replaced by something softer, spongier, like walking on moss. That's when I heard the first voice. Marcus. Marcus, help me. It was Sarah Martinez's voice, coming from somewhere in the fog ahead of me. Clear as day, unmistakably hers. I'd heard her voice on the 911 call Tyler had made, pleading for help in finding his lost girlfriend. Every instinct told me to follow the voice, to rescue the missing hiker. But Mary Crow Feather's warning echoed in my mind. Don't follow voices in the mist. I key my radio instead. Base, this is Ranger Webb. I'm on the Forney Ridge Trail investigating the Martinez disappearance. Visibility is zero due to unusual fog conditions. Static was the only response. Sarah's voice came again, closer now, more urgent. Marcus, please. I'm hurt. I can't find a trail. I forced myself to remain still, fighting the overwhelming urge to help. The voice sounded exactly like Sarah, down to the slight Tennessee accent and the tremor of fear. But Sarah Martinez had been missing for 4 days. Even if she was alive, she wouldn't know my name. The fog swirled around me, and I caught glimpses of movement within it. Tall shapes, just as Tyler had described, moving with an odd gliding motion that didn't look quite human. They stayed at the edge of visibility, never quite clear enough to make out details, but definitely there. I see you, Marcus, Sarah's voice whispered, much closer now. Why won't you help me? I pulled out the iron nail Mary Crow Feather had given me, holding it like a talisman. The moment my fingers closed around it, the fog seemed to recoil slightly, creating a small bubble of clearer air around me. That's when I saw her, or what was pretending to be her. The thing stood perhaps 10 feet away, and at first glance, it looked exactly like Sarah Martinez. Same height, same build, same long brown hair. But as I watched, the details began to shift and blur, as if I was seeing her through water. Her face was almost right, but the proportions were slightly off. Eyes too large, mouth too wide, features that seemed to flow and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Come with me, Marcus. Not Sarah said, extending a hand that had too many fingers. I'll show you where the others are. Others. Plural. The fog thickened again, and more shapes emerged from the white void. A tall man who might have been David Chin, the first missing hiker. A woman who could have been Jennifer Walsh, still carrying her camera. But like the Sarah thing, they were wrong in subtle ways. Details that the human mind couldn't quite process. Faces that shifted and changed when observed directly. They formed a circle around me, all speaking at once in voices I recognized from missing person reports, interviews with family members, desperate pleas for help. But underneath their words, I could hear something else, a sound like wind through hollow trees or whispers in a language that predated human speech. The iron nail in my hand grew warm, then hot. The fake hikers recoiled from me, their forms becoming less solid, more obviously unreal. Whatever they were, they couldn't maintain their human disguises in the presence of iron. That's when I saw their true forms. They were tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched like shadows and faces that were nothing but smooth, pale masks with dark holes where eyes should be. They moved like smoke given form, flowing through the fog with predatory grace. And there were dozens of them, filling the white void around me. I understood then what had happened to the missing hikers. These things, whatever they were, used the fog as camouflage, calling to lost travelers with the voices of loved ones, friends, anyone who might convince them to venture deeper into the mist. Once separated from the marked trails, from the iron-rich soil and running water that seemed to limit their power, the victims would be easy prey. But prey for what? What did these entities want with human beings? The answer came as one of them spoke, not with a borrowed human voice, but in its own alien tongue, a sound like wind through empty skulls. I shouldn't have been able to understand it, but somehow I did, as if the knowledge was being placed directly in my mind. They were old, these things. Older than the mountains themselves. They had watched the peaks rise from primordial seas, had seen the first life crawl from the oceans to the land. They were watchers, observers, existing in the spaces between reality and dream. Human consciousness fascinated them. The complexity of emotion, memory, imagination, these were concepts foreign to their ancient minds. They collected humans not to harm them, but to study them, to experience human thought and feeling through their captives. The missing hikers weren't dead. They were kept in a place between the physical world and somewhere else, their minds providing endless entertainment for entities that had existed in changeless void for eons. Join them, the nearest entity whispered in a voice like rustling leaves. Add your thoughts to our collection. Your memories, your fears, your dreams, they will live forever in our realm. The offer was almost tempting. To be part of something ancient and eternal, to have my consciousness preserved for all time. But I'd seen Tyler's haunted eyes, heard the desperation in the voices of the families still searching for their missing loved ones. I held the iron nail higher, and the entities fell back. But I could feel their hunger, their alien patience. They had waited millennia for human minds to study. They could wait a little longer. The fog began to thin, whether from my iron talisman or some other factor, I couldn't tell. The entities retreated with it, fading back into the white void like nightmares at dawn. Their whispered promises and threats grew fainter, replaced by the normal sounds of the mountain forest, wind through pines, the distant call of birds. When the mist finally lifted completely, I found myself standing on a section of trail I'd never seen before, despite 8 years of patrolling these mountains. Ancient stone markers lined the path, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. This was one of the old places Mary Crow Feather had warned me about, where the Cherokee had left offerings to appease the things that watched from the heights. My GPS showed I was miles from where I should have been, in a section of the park that wasn't on any official map. It took me 6 hours of hard hiking to find a trail I recognized, following game paths and ridgelines that seemed to exist only when I wasn't looking directly at them. I made it back to the ranger station as the sun was setting, exhausted and shaken but alive. The official report I filed was carefully worded. Unusual weather conditions, equipment malfunction, no sign of the missing hikers. The truth would have ended my career and probably landed me in psychiatric evaluation. But I knew what I had to do. Working with Mary Crow Feather and a handful of other Cherokee elders who still remembered the old ways, I began placing iron markers along the most dangerous sections of trail, old railroad spikes, and pieces of steel disguised as geological survey markers. We scattered salt at key junctions, planted rowan trees near camping areas, and quietly spread word among the local hiking community about certain trails to avoid during foggy conditions. The disappearances stopped. Oh, hikers still went missing occasionally. The mountains were dangerous enough without supernatural assistance. But the pattern of inexplicable vanishings, the complete absence of any trace, that ended after we finished placing our protections. Sometimes on foggy mornings when the mist rises thick from valleys, I can still hear them calling. Voices in the white void, promising knowledge, offering eternity, hungry for the spark of human consciousness that they can never truly understand. I carry an iron nail in my pocket now always, and I tell other rangers subtly, carefully, about the importance of staying on marked trails when visibility is poor. The mountains have eyes, it's true, but some things are better left unwatched. The fog is rolling in again tonight. I can see it from my station window, creeping up from the hollows like the fingers of something vast and patient. Tomorrow I'll patrol the high trails again, listening for voices that shouldn't exist, watching for shapes that move wrong in the mist. It's what rangers do. We protect the wilderness and those who venture into it, even from the wilderness itself. My name is Diana Reeves, and I've been a ranger in the Olympic National Forest for 12 years. I've tracked black bears through old-growth cedar groves, rescued lost hikers from ravines that seemed to swallow sound itself, and spent countless nights alone in the deepest wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. I thought I knew every danger these ancient forests could present. I was wrong. The trouble started in September, just as the tourist season was winding down and the forest was settling into its autumn rhythm. We'd had a series of animal attacks, or what we thought were animal attacks, along the remote trails that wound through the Hoh River Valley. The first incident involved a group of college students from Seattle who'd been backpacking the Hoh River Trail. They'd been camping at Lewis Meadow, a popular backcountry site, when something had attacked their campsite in the middle of the night. 3 of the 4 students were found dead, their bodies savagely mauled. The fourth, a young woman named Jessica Chin, had survived by hiding in a tree for 6 hours until other hikers found her. Jessica's account was disturbing, but not entirely unusual. She described being awakened by screaming, seeing large shapes moving through the campsite, and climbing the nearest tree in panic. She'd stayed there until dawn, too terrified to come down even after the sounds of the attack had faded. The physical evidence supported her story. The campsite was destroyed, tents shredded, supplies scattered and destroyed. The victims' bodies showed the kind of damage you'd expect from a large predator: deep claw marks, massive bite wounds, evidence of incredible strength. But there were inconsistencies that bothered me from the beginning. The attack pattern was wrong for any native predator. Black bears were omnivores who rarely attacked humans unprovoked, and even then, a single bear wouldn't methodically hunt down multiple victims. Cougars were solitary ambush predators, not pack hunters. And the largest carnivores in the Olympic forest weren't big enough to inflict the kind of damage we'd found. More troubling were the footprints around the campsite. Mixed in with expected paw prints were tracks that looked disturbingly human, except for the size. Whatever had made them had feet at least 14 inches long, with claw marks extending well beyond the toe impressions. The second attack happened 2 weeks later, this time targeting a family of 4 camping near the Quinault River. Same pattern, nighttime assault, total destruction of the campsite, multiple victims torn apart with savage efficiency. The only survivor was the family's teenage son, who'd managed to escape into the river and hide beneath a fallen log until morning. His story was similar to Jessica's, but with additional details that made my blood run cold. According to the boy, the attackers had moved through the campsite with obvious intelligence, systematically destroying equipment and hunting down the fleeing family members. He'd heard them communicating, not with animal sounds, but with something that sounded almost like human speech, if humans could growl and bark their words. By the time of the third attack, the media had picked up the story. Reporters speculated about everything from rogue bears to escaped exotic animals to a possible serial killer using trained dogs. The Forest Service brought in specialists from around the country, wildlife biologists, tracking experts, even criminal profilers. None of them could explain what we were dealing with. That's when I decided to investigate personally. I'd grown up in these forests, had spent my entire adult life learning their secrets. If something new was hunting in my territory, I was going to find it. I waited for the harvest moon. There was a pattern to the attacks that everyone else had missed. They only happened during the new moon or the full moon, never during the phases in between. And they always occurred in the deepest, most remote parts of the forest, far from any roads or regular patrols. The harvest moon in October was going to be perfect for my investigation, the brightest full moon of the year, providing natural illumination while keeping me hidden in the forest shadows. I planned to stake out the Bogachiel River Valley, where the most recent attack had occurred. I went in light, carrying only essential gear, my service weapon, emergency supplies, night vision equipment, and a high-powered camera to document whatever I found. I left my radio behind deliberately. Its signals might spook whatever I was tracking, and besides, I'd be too far from any ranger station for effective communication anyway. The hike to my observation point took most of the day. I chose a ridge overlooking the river valley, with good sight lines to the area where the last attack had occurred. I arrived 2 hours before sunset, giving me time to set up my position and prepare for what I hoped would be an uneventful night of observation. The forest was unusually quiet as darkness fell. No owls calling, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the ever-present sound of the river seemed muted. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The first sign that I wasn't alone came just after midnight. A branch cracked somewhere in the valley below me, the sharp sound carrying clearly in the still air. Then another and another, as if something large was moving through the forest without any attempt at stealth. Through my night vision scope, I could see shapes moving between the trees, dark forms that seemed too large and too coordinated to be any native wildlife. There were at least 6 of them, moving in a loose formation through the forest. They kept to the shadows, but occasionally one would step into a moonbeam, and I caught glimpses of things that made no sense. They walked upright like humans, but their proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad through the shoulders, with arms that hung past their knees and heads that seemed too large for their bodies. Their movement was fluid but alien, as if they were still learning how to use their limbs properly. As they moved closer to my position, I could make out more details through the scope. Their skin was dark and mottled, covered with what looked like coarse hair or fur. Their faces were the worst part, basically human in structure but distorted, stretched, with features that had been rearranged by forces I couldn't understand. They were communicating with each other, just as the teenage survivor had described. Not quite human speech, not quite animal sounds, but something in between that made my skin crawl. Whatever language they were using, it was clear they were coordinating their movements, working together with frightening intelligence. That's when I realized what I was looking at. These weren't animals. They weren't some unknown species or escaped experimental subjects. They were human or had been human once. Something had changed them, transformed them into predators that retained their human intelligence while gaining the strength and savagery of wild beasts. The transformation wasn't complete. I could see evidence of their humanity in their behavior, in the way they used tools, makeshift weapons crafted from branches and stone, and in their obvious understanding of human psychology. They knew how to terrorize their victims, how to inflict maximum psychological damage before moving in for the kill. They were hunting humans because they remembered being human themselves. One of them stopped directly below my position and looked up toward the ridge. Even through the night vision scope, I could see its eyes, intelligent, calculating, and completely alien in their hunger. It sniffed the air, testing for scents, and I realized it was tracking me. I held perfectly still, barely breathing, as the thing studied the ridge where I was hidden. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it made a sound, a low barking call that was answered by the others. They began to spread out, surrounding the base of the ridge. They knew I was here. I had two choices, run or fight. Running meant trying to outpace creatures that were clearly faster and stronger than any human, through terrain they knew as well as I did. Fighting meant going up against at least 6 predators with nothing but my sidearm and whatever makeshift weapons I could find. I chose a third option. Moving carefully to avoid making any sound, I began to retreat deeper into the ridge, looking for defensible ground. There was an old ranger shelter about half a mile away, built in the 1960s and officially abandoned but still structurally sound. If I could reach it, I'd have walls between me and whatever was hunting me. The retreat turned into a running battle almost immediately. The creatures were faster than I'd expected, moving through the forest with inhuman grace. I could hear them communicating as they tracked me, their barking calls echoing from different directions as they tried to surround me. I made it to the shelter just as the first of them emerged from the tree line behind me. The building was little more than a log cabin with a tin roof, but it had solid walls and only one door. I slammed the door behind me and threw the ancient deadbolt just as something massive crashed into the wood from outside. The shelter shook with the impact, but the door held. For now. Through the single window, I could see them circling the building, testing its defenses. They moved with purpose, examining the walls, checking for weak points, obviously planning their assault. Whatever had transformed them hadn't diminished their human intelligence. If anything, it had enhanced it with predatory cunning. One of them began to climb onto the roof. I could hear its claws scraping against the tin, feel the building shake as it moved across the metal surface. It was looking for another way in, and I realized it would probably find one. The shelter had been built for protection from weather, not from determined predators. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting for them to break in, I kicked open the door and came out shooting. The first creature was caught off guard by my sudden aggression. My first shot took its center mass, spinning it around but not dropping it. The thing that had been on the roof leaped down with a howl of rage, and I put 2 rounds into its chest before it could reach me. They were tough, far tougher than any human had a right to be, but they weren't invulnerable. The wounded creatures fell back, and the others hesitated, apparently reassessing the threat I represented. I used their momentary confusion to break for the tree line, hoping to lose them in the dense forest. But as I ran, I could hear them regrouping behind me, their barking calls filled with anger and renewed determination. The chase lasted until dawn. They hunted me through the darkest parts of the Olympic rainforest, through groves of ancient cedar, where the canopy blocked out even the harvest moon's light. They were relentless, coordinated, and utterly savage in their pursuit. But they were also cautious now, having learned that their prey could fight back. I used every trick I'd learned in 12 years of wilderness work. Stream beds to hide my scent, thick undergrowth to break their sight lines, rocky ground to muffle my footsteps. Gradually, I began to gain distance on them, until their calls faded into the background noise of the forest. When the sun finally rose, they were gone. I found myself alone on a ridge overlooking the whole river, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. The forest had returned to its normal sounds. Birds calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the constant murmur of running water. It was as if the night had been a nightmare, except for the claw marks on the abandoned shelter and the blood on my clothes from creatures that shouldn't exist. I hiked out of the forest in a daze, trying to process what I'd experienced. By the time I reached my vehicle, I decided not to report what I'd seen. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? Instead, I did research. I spent weeks digging through old records, Native American legends, historical accounts of unexplained disappearances in the Olympic Peninsula. What I found was a pattern stretching back over a century, stories of people who vanished in the deep forest, only to return changed, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. The local tribes had stories about it, a curse that could befall those who spent too long alone in the deepest parts of the forest, who gave in to despair and rage and hunger. They spoke of people who became Wendigo-like creatures, driven by an insatiable need to hunt and kill. But this wasn't the Wendigo of Algonquian legend. This was something specific to the Pacific Northwest, something that had been transforming people in these forests for generations. The pattern was always the same. Someone would disappear in the wilderness, usually during a time of emotional trauma or desperation. Months or years later, they would return, but changed. No longer human, but retaining enough of their human intelligence to make them incredibly dangerous. They formed packs, these transformed humans. They communicated, used tools, planned their attacks with frightening sophistication. And they were virtually impossible to track or predict because they thought like humans while possessing the physical capabilities of apex predators. I realized that the recent attacks weren't random. They were coordinated assaults by a pack of these creatures, probably led by someone who had been transformed recently enough to retain detailed knowledge of human behavior and psychology. The attacks stopped after my encounter with them. Whether I'd killed some of them or they'd simply decided the area was too dangerous, I never knew. But the pattern of savage assaults on campers and hikers ended abruptly. I transferred out of the Olympic National Forest 6 months later. Officially, it was for career advancement. Unofficially, I couldn't stand the thought of spending another night in those ancient woods, knowing what hunted in their depths. But I still monitor the reports. Still watch for the signs that might indicate another pack has formed, another group of transformed humans has begun hunting in the deep forests. Because they're still out there. In the Olympic Peninsula and probably in other remote wilderness areas around the world. People who crossed some invisible line in their desperation or despair, who gave up their humanity in exchange for the power to hunt and kill without remorse. They remember being human. That's what makes them so dangerous. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the forest is unusually quiet, I wonder if I came closer to joining them than I'd like to admit. The harvest moon is rising again. Somewhere in the deep woods, the pack is hunting. I just pray they're hunting animals now, not people. But I know better. My name is Michael Brooks, and I've been a ranger at Death Valley National Park for 11 years. I've seen temperatures that would kill a man in minutes, flash floods that could reshape the landscape overnight, and mirages so convincing they've lured experienced hikers to their deaths. I thought I understood the desert's dangers. I was wrong. Death Valley is a place of extremes, the lowest point in North America, the hottest place on Earth, one of the driest locations in the Western Hemisphere. It's a landscape that seems almost alien, with salt flats that stretch to the horizon, mountains that rise like broken teeth from the desert floor, and sand dunes that shift and change with every wind. But it's also a place with a history that most visitors never learn about. The Timbisha Shoshone people lived here for over 1,000 years before European settlers arrived, and they had names for places that reflected deeper truths about the desert's nature. Places like Deadwood Canyon. The canyon got its modern name from the early prospectors who tried to establish mining claims in the area during the 1880s gold rush. They found the canyon filled with the petrified remains of an ancient forest, trees that had been turned to stone by volcanic ash and mineral deposits over millions of years. But the Timbisha called it something else, Yoepai, which roughly translates to where the spirits wait. The prospectors should have listened to the indigenous warnings. The first documented disappearance in Deadwood Canyon occurred in 1887, when a mining party of 6 men vanished without a trace. Their equipment was found scattered throughout the canyon, but no bodies were ever recovered. The local newspapers blamed it on bandits or a flash flood, but the Timbishan knew better. Over the decades, the pattern repeated. People would enter Deadwood Canyon and simply vanish. Sometimes their vehicles would be found, doors open, engines still running. Sometimes their camping gear would be discovered, laid out as if they'd simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. By the time Death Valley became a national park in 1994, Deadwood Canyon had been quietly removed from most hiking maps. The official explanation was that the terrain was too dangerous for recreational use, but the real reason was that too many people had disappeared there over the years. I might never have learned the truth if it hadn't been for the Henderson family. They were from Phoenix, father, mother, teenage daughter, and 8-year-old son visiting Death Valley during their summer vacation. Against all advice, they had decided to explore some of the more remote areas of the park, including several canyons that weren't on the tourist maps. When they failed to return to their hotel in Furnace Creek, a search was launched. Their rental car was found at the entrance to Deadwood Canyon, but there was no sign of the family themselves. The searchers found footprints leading into the canyon, but the tracks simply ended about a mile from the entrance, as if the family had simply evaporated into the desert air. I was part of the initial search team, but as the days passed without any trace of the Hendersons, I began to suspect that conventional search methods weren't going to be enough. There was something about Deadwood Canyon that didn't show up on any topographical map, something that could only be understood by spending time there alone. So I went in by myself. I entered the canyon at dawn, carrying enough water for 3 days and emergency supplies for a week. The desert heat was already oppressive, but inside the canyon, it was even worse. The rock walls seemed to trap and concentrate the heat, creating a furnace-like environment that made breathing difficult. The petrified forest was more extensive than I had expected. Hundreds of stone trees filled the canyon floor, their fossilized trunks rising like monuments to some ancient catastrophe. But there was something unsettling about their arrangement. They seemed too organized, too deliberate, as if they'd been placed rather than naturally deposited. As I hiked deeper into the canyon, I began to notice other anomalies. The rock formations were wrong somehow, carved into shapes that suggested purpose rather than random erosion. Symbols were etched into the canyon walls, not recent graffiti, but ancient markings that seemed to have been carved by tools that left no trace of their passing. And then there were the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible above the sound of wind through the stone trees. But as the day wore on, they grew clearer, more distinct. Multiple voices, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, seeming to come from different directions within the canyon. By evening, I could make out individual words, though they were in no language I'd ever heard. The voices had a hypnotic quality, drawing me deeper into the canyon despite my growing unease. There was something compelling about them, something that made me want to follow them to their source. That's when I saw the first figure. It appeared among the petrified trees, tall and gaunt, wearing what looked like the tattered remains of 19th century clothing. For a moment, I thought it might be a lost hiker, but as I approached, I realized the figure was translucent, shimmering in the heat like a mirage. The figure turned toward me, and I saw its face, or rather, the absence of a face. Where features should have been, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I stumbled backward, and the figure vanished. But now I could see others moving among the stone trees, dozens of them, all wearing the clothing of different eras. Some dressed like the original prospectors, others in the hiking gear of more recent decades. All of them had the same terrible absence where their faces should have been. They were the disappeared. Everyone who had vanished in Deadwood Canyon over the past 130 years, trapped in some sort of liminal existence between life and death. As darkness fell, they became more solid, more real. I could hear their voices clearly now, speaking in the languages of their times, calling out to each other across the canyon. They moved with purpose, gathering in groups, performing activities I couldn't understand. But they all seemed to be waiting for something. That's when I saw the Henderson family. They were among the newest arrivals, still wearing their hiking clothes from the day they disappeared. The parents were holding hands, looking around in confusion, while their children stayed close beside them. Unlike the older spirits, they still had their faces, though they looked pale and insubstantial. I called out to them, but they couldn't hear me. It was as if I existed in a different layer of reality, able to see them but not interact directly. They were trapped in whatever force had claimed them, gradually losing their humanity as they joined the ranks of the canyon's permanent residents. That's when I understood what Deadwood Canyon really was. It wasn't just a geological formation, it was a trap, a place where the boundary between life and death had been weakened by some ancient catastrophe. The petrified forest wasn't just a fossil deposit. It was the remains of a living ecosystem that had been transformed in a single moment, caught between states of existence. The symbols on the canyon walls weren't random markings. They were warnings, left by the Timbisha people who had recognized the danger and tried to contain it. The canyon was a wound in reality itself, a place where the normal rules of existence didn't apply. And it was hungry. I could feel it now, a presence that permeated the entire canyon, drawing energy from the people who wandered into its influence. The spirits I was seeing weren't just trapped souls, they were being consumed, their life force slowly drained away to feed something that existed in the spaces between worlds. The Henderson family was already beginning to fade. Their children had lost their ability to speak, and their parents were starting to show the same vacant expressions as the older spirits. Soon, they would join the ranks of the faceless ones, their identities consumed by the canyon's malevolent influence. I had to act quickly. Drawing on every piece of folklore and indigenous knowledge I'd accumulated over the years, I began to work. The Timbisha had left more than just warnings in the canyon. They had left tools, ritual objects hidden in caches throughout the area, designed to help anyone who might need to combat the canyon's influence. I found the first cache hidden beneath a pile of stones that had been arranged in a specific pattern. Inside was a collection of objects that seemed almost mundane, pieces of quartz, bundles of sage, small clay, figurines that represented protective spirits. But when I held them, I could feel their power, the accumulated faith and intention of generations of people who had worked to keep the canyon's influence contained. Working through the night, I began to perform the rituals I had learned from Timbisha elders, using the tools they had left behind to strengthen the barriers between worlds. It was exhausting work, requiring me to channel energies I barely understood while fighting against the canyon's attempts to claim me as well. But gradually, I began to see results. The spirits became more agitated, more visible, as if the rituals were disrupting their dormant state. The Henderson family looked around in confusion, seeming to see their surroundings clearly for the first time since their disappearance. "Where are we?" Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice echoing strangely in the canyon. "You're in Deadwood Canyon," I replied, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. "You've been trapped here, but I'm going to get you out." The older spirits began to move toward me, their faceless forms suddenly menacing. They had been claimed by the canyon so completely that they now serve its will, and they didn't want to see their newest recruits escape. But the protective rituals held. The spirits couldn't approach within a certain radius of the ritual objects, and I was able to continue my work. As dawn approached, I completed the final ritual, a complex ceremony designed to temporarily open a path between the canyon's influence and the normal world. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Henderson family suddenly became solid, real, visible in normal light. They looked around in amazement, seeing the canyon as it truly was for the first time. "We need to leave," I told them. "Right now, before the path closes." They didn't argue. Something in my voice or the strangeness of their surroundings convinced them to follow without question. We made our way quickly through the canyon, past the petrified trees and the ancient symbols, toward the entrance in safety. Behind us, the spirits followed, their wails of frustration and loss echoing off the canyon walls. But they couldn't leave the canyon's boundaries, couldn't pursue us into the normal world. We made it out just as the sun fully cleared the horizon, and the canyon's influence began to wane with the growing daylight. The Henderson family was traumatized but alive. They had no memory of their time in the canyon, only a vague recollection of becoming lost and then suddenly finding themselves with me at the canyon entrance. The official reports stated that they had become disoriented by the heat and had been found by routine patrol. But I knew the truth. Deadwood Canyon remained what it had always been, a trap, a wound in reality that fed on the unwary. The rituals I had performed hadn't destroyed it, only temporarily weakened its influence. The spirits were still there, still waiting, still hungry. Working with the Timbisha Shoshone Tribal Council, I arranged for the canyon to be permanently closed to public access. New barriers were erected, not just physical ones, but spiritual protections that would reinforce the ancient warnings. The official explanation was environmental protection. The petrified forest was too fragile to allow unrestricted access. But the real reason was that some places are too dangerous for human contact, too alien for human understanding. I still patrol the desert around Deadwood Canyon, watching for signs that its influence might be spreading, monitoring the spiritual barriers that keep it contained. It's a responsibility I inherited from the Timbisha people, a duty that will someday be passed on to someone else. The desert remembers everything, the ancient forest that was turned to stone, the people who vanished into the canyon's influence, the rituals that keep the danger contained. And it's taught me that some places are windows into aspects of reality that humans weren't meant to comprehend. Deadwood Canyon is still there, waiting in the heart of Death Valley. The spirits still walk among the petrified trees, still call out to anyone who might listen. But now they call to empty air because no one enters the canyon anymore. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its prisoners. And I am its warden, standing guard over a place where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, where the hungry darkness waits for the unwary to venture too far from the safety of the known world. The canyon dreams, and in its dreams, the faceless spirits wait for their chance to escape into the light. But as long as I draw breath, as long as the ancient protections hold, they will wait in vain. The desert remembers everything, and some things are better left forgotten. The first thing they don't tell you about working alone at a remote ranger station is how the silence gets into your head. The second thing they don't tell you is that sometimes the silence isn't empty. I found that out during my third winter at Echo Lake Station, a one-man outpost in the deepest part of the Adirondack wilderness. My name is Tom Sullivan, and for 5 years I've been the sole guardian of 75,000 acres of pristine forest, crystal-clear lakes, and things that should not exist. Echo Lake sits in a glacial cirque 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail in summer and snowshoe in winter. It's a perfect circle of black water surrounded by towering pines, fed by underground springs that keep it from freezing completely even in the harshest weather. The Abenaki people who originally inhabited this region had a name for it that roughly translates to the lake that dreams, and they avoided it completely after the first snows fell. I should have asked them why. The incident that changed everything happened on February 14th, during the worst blizzard in 30 years. I've been monitoring weather reports all week, preparing for what meteorologists were calling a historic snow event. By the time the storm hit, I was as ready as anyone could be. Generator fueled, food stores stocked, communication equipment tested and retested. What I wasn't prepared for was what the storm would bring up from the depths of Echo Lake. The blizzard began just after midnight, and by dawn 3 feet of snow had already fallen with no sign of letting up. The wind howled through the pines like something alive and angry, creating drifts that buried my station's windows and blocked the door. I spent most of the morning digging out, fighting to keep my solar panels clear and my radio antenna from collapsing under the weight of ice. It was during a brief lull in the storm, around 2 in the afternoon, that I first heard the sound. A rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat, coming from the direction of the lake. At first I thought it might be ice shifting. Echo Lake never froze solid, but the surface developed a thick skim that could crack and groan under the weight of accumulating snow. But this was different. Too regular, too deliberate. I pulled on my winter gear and fought my way through the drifts to the lake shore. The storm had obscured everything beyond 20 feet, but I could make out the dark water in the center where the underground springs kept the lake from freezing. The thumping was definitely coming from there, somewhere beneath the surface. As I watched, the water began to bubble and churn, as if something massive was moving in the depths. The bubbles formed a pattern, concentric circles spreading outward from the lake's center, each ring larger than the last. And with each ring, the thumping grew louder. Then the lights began. Deep in the black water, a faint phosphorescent glow appeared. It pulsed in rhythm with the thumping sound, growing brighter with each beat. Other lights joined it, dozens of them, creating a constellation beneath the surface that seemed to stretch down into impossible depths. I've been a park ranger for 15 years before my assignment to Echo Lake, and I'd never seen anything like it. Bioluminescent algae could create underwater light displays, but not in water this cold, and not in patterns this complex. The lights were moving now, swirling through the depths in formations that looked almost like a city. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in the deep snow. The lights were definitely artificial, or at least controlled by some intelligence. They formed geometric patterns, straight lines, and perfect circles that no natural phenomenon could create. And they were vast. The glow extended down further than my light could penetrate, suggesting structures of enormous size hidden in the lake's depths. That's when I remembered the old geological surveys. When Echo Lake Station was established in 1987, the state had commissioned a comprehensive study of the area's natural features. I'd read the reports during my initial training, but one detail had always stuck with me. The sonar readings of Echo Lake had been inconclusive. The equipment kept returning depth measurements that made no sense, sometimes showing the lake bottom at 200 feet, sometimes at 2,000, sometimes not finding a bottom at all. The official explanation was equipment malfunction, possibly caused by unusual mineral deposits or underground cave systems. But looking at those lights pulsing in the depths, I began to wonder if the sonar had been working perfectly. The thumping sound grew louder, more insistent. The lights began to rise. I watched in fascination and growing terror as the underwater illumination ascended through the water column, growing brighter and more defined as it approached the surface. I could make out individual light sources now, not the diffuse glow of bioluminescence, but the hard, focused beams of artificial illumination. Structures became visible in the glow, angular shapes that definitely weren't natural rock formations. They looked like buildings or vehicles rising from the lake's hidden depths. And they were huge. What I had initially taken for a city might have been closer to the truth than I'd realized. The first structure broke the surface just as the storm resumed in full fury. It emerged slowly, water cascading from its sides in sheets. In the swirling snow and limited visibility, it was hard to make out details, but I could see enough to know that whatever I was looking at wasn't supposed to exist. The structure was pyramidal, maybe 40 feet tall, made of some material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface was smooth and seamless, like polished obsidian, but with an organic quality that made it look grown rather than built. Symbols were carved into its sides, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to process. More structures followed, rising from the depths like a sunken city returning to life. Some were tall and spindly, like metallic trees reaching toward the sky. Others were broad and low, spreading across the lake's surface like mechanical lily pads. All of them glowed with that same cold, phosphorescent light. And then I saw the inhabitants. They emerged from openings in the structures, tall, impossibly thin figures that moved with liquid grace despite their apparent solidity. In the storm and limited light, I couldn't make out details, but they were clearly not human. Too tall, too thin, with proportions that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. They paid no attention to me at first, going about what looked like routine activities, tending to equipment, moving objects from one structure to another, performing tasks I couldn't begin to understand. But as I watched, transfixed and terrified, one of them turned in my direction. Even at a distance, even through the snow and darkness, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. It stood motionless for a long moment, studying me with senses I couldn't fathom. Then it raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at me. The others stopped what they were doing and turned. Dozens of them, all focusing their alien attention on the lone human watching from the shore. The thumping sound grew louder, more urgent, and the lights in the water began to pulse faster. I ran. Fighting through the deep snow, I stumbled back toward my station, every step feeling like it took forever. Behind me, I could hear sounds that made my skin crawl, splashing, as if massive bodies were entering the water, and something else. A low, droning sound like whale song, but with harmonics that no earthly creature could produce. I made it to my station and barricaded the door, though I knew it would provide little protection against whatever those things were. My hands shaking, I tried to radio for help, but the storm was interfering with communications. All I got was static. For the next 6 hours, I huddled in my station while the storm raged outside. But it wasn't just wind and snow I was hearing. There were other sounds, scraping against the walls, footsteps on a roof, and that alien droning that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were exploring, learning, studying the human structure and, by extension, the human who lived in it. Around midnight, the sound stopped. The storm began to weaken, and by dawn it had passed completely, leaving behind a world buried in pristine white snow. I waited another hour before venturing outside, half convinced that I'd hallucinated the entire experience. The lake was frozen solid. Not just the usual skim of ice that formed during cold snaps, but a complete sheet of ice thick enough to walk on. It was as if the water had frozen instantly, trapping whatever had risen from the depths beneath the crystalline ceiling. But the structures were still there. I could see them through the ice, dark shapes arranged in impossible configurations, like a city built by minds that didn't understand human concepts of architecture. And the lights were still glowing, creating an eerie phosphorescence that turned the ice blue-green. Most disturbing of all, I could see the figures moving beneath the ice. Dozens of them, going about their alien business in the trapped structures, occasionally pressing against the underside of the ice as if testing its strength. I knew I should report this. Should call in scientists, government officials, someone who could deal with whatever Echo Lake had revealed. But who would believe me? And more importantly, what had happened to these things if the outside world learned of their existence? Over the next few days, I did research. I called in favors from contacts at universities, searched through old records and Native American oral histories. What I found chilled me more than the February wind. Echo Lake wasn't unique. There were dozens of similar bodies of water throughout the Adirondacks, all perfectly circular, all fed by underground springs, all avoided by the original inhabitants. The Abenaki had stories about them, gateways to the lower world where ancient beings slept until the time came for them to return. According to the legends, these beings were older than humanity, older than most life on Earth. They had arrived from somewhere else, the stars, the depths of space, dimensions beyond human understanding, and had been waiting beneath the lakes for countless millennia. The legends spoke of signs that would herald their awakening, unusual weather patterns, lights in the water, and the singing of the deep places. Once awakened, they would begin the process of reclaiming their world, starting with the bodies of water that served as their hidden cities. The ice began to crack on the fifth day. I heard it start around noon, a sharp report like a gunshot, followed by a network of fractures spreading across the lake surface. The alien city beneath responded immediately, the lights pulsing faster and the droning song growing louder. By evening, open water had appeared in the center of the lake. The structures began to rise again, emerging from the depths like mechanical flowers blooming in the twilight. But this time, they came up faster, more purposefully. And this time, the inhabitants came with them. They stood on the surfaces of their structures, no longer hiding beneath the water. In the clear post-storm air, I could see them properly for the first time, and I wished I couldn't. They were tall, easily 8 feet, with limbs that seemed to bend at joints that shouldn't exist. Their skin, if it could be called skin, was pale and translucent, revealing what might have been organs or machinery beneath. Their heads were elongated, almost cone-shaped, with features that suggested eyes and mouths, but arranged in ways that made no sense to human perception. But it was their movements that were most disturbing. They didn't walk so much as flow, their bodies seeming to adapt to whatever surface they were on. I watched one of them descend the side of a pyramidal structure, its form shifting and changing as it moved, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes seeming to phase partially through the structure itself. They were preparing for something. I could see equipment being moved, devices being assembled, patterns being formed on the surfaces of the larger structures. The whole operation had an air of ceremony, of something that had been planned for a very long time. That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't an invasion or an awakening. This was a homecoming. These beings had been here long before humans arrived in North America. The perfectly circular lakes weren't natural formations. They were artificial harbors, designed to conceal underwater cities while their inhabitants waited for conditions to be right for their return to the surface world. And now, after centuries of waiting, that time had come. The realization should have sent me fleeing towards civilization, should have had me screaming warnings into my radio. Instead, I found myself walking toward the lake shore, drawn by compulsion I couldn't resist. The aliens noticed my approach. Several of them turned in my direction, and I felt that same weight of alien attention I'd experienced during the storm. But this time, instead of fear, I felt curiosity. They were studying me just as intently as I was studying them. One of them, larger than the others, with more complex patterns on its translucent skin, began to move toward the shore. It walked across the water's surface as if it were solid, its form shifting and adapting with each step. We met at the water's edge. Up close, the being was even more impossible than it had appeared from a distance. Its flesh wasn't flesh at all, but something that existed in a state between liquid and solid, constantly shifting and reforming. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a collection of sensory organs arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. It spoke, not with words but with images that appeared directly in my mind. I saw the history of its people, their arrival on Earth millions of years ago, their decision to retreat beneath the waters as the planet's ecosystem changed, their long patience as they waited for the right conditions to emerge. I saw their purpose. They were not conquerors but gardeners, cultivating life on worlds throughout the galaxy. Earth was one of their oldest projects, and they had been waiting for humanity to reach the right stage of development before revealing themselves. The Ice Age was ending, they showed me. Not the recent glacial period, but the true Ice Age, a cosmic winter that had kept their kind dormant for eons. The signs were all there: the changing climate, the increasing instability of weather patterns, the awakening of other sleeping places around the world. They were coming home. The being reached out with something that might have been a hand, its flesh flowing like water as it approached my face. The touch was cold and electric, and suddenly I understood why I'd been drawn to this place, why I'd been chosen to witness their return. I was to be their herald. The knowledge flowed into me like ice water through my veins. The locations of other hidden cities, the timeline of their awakening, the signs that would herald their full emergence. I saw a world transformed, not destroyed but evolved, with humanity serving as caretakers for a garden planet tended by beings older than recorded history. When the contact ended, I found myself alone on the shore. The structures had vanished beneath the water, the lights had dimmed, and the lake was returning to its normal state. But the knowledge remained, burning in my mind like a brand. I walked back to my station in a daze, understanding finally why I'd been assigned to this remote outpost. The selection hadn't been random. Somehow they'd been watching, waiting, choosing humans who could serve as bridges between their world and ours. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been preparing. Following the instructions given to me during that alien contact, I've been monitoring other sites, watching for signs of awakening. The network is vast. Hundreds of hidden cities and lakes, rivers, and underground caverns around the world, all connected by tunnels and waterways that exist in dimensions beyond normal space. They're all stirring now, all preparing for the Great Awakening. I've seen the signs: unusual weather patterns, mass migrations of animals, electromagnetic anomalies that have scientists baffled. The media calls it climate change, natural disasters, unexplained phenomena. But I know the truth. The gardeners are returning. My role is small but important. When the time comes, and it's coming soon, I'll be ready to help humanity understand what's happening. To serve as a translator between our species and beings so alien that direct contact would drive most people insane. It's a terrifying responsibility, but also a privilege. I'm one of the first humans to know that we're not alone, that we never have been, and that our world is part of something much larger and more ancient than we ever imagined. The lake is calling to me again. I can hear it in the quiet moments, that alien song that speaks of depths beyond measure and cities that dream beneath the waves. Soon, I'll answer that call. Soon, I'll take my place as herald of the new age. The things beneath Echo Lake are patient, but their patience is ending. The Ice Age is over. The gardeners are coming home, and I'll be there to welcome them.